What happens when someone convinces you that something is wrong with you, even when it isn't? What if you start to believe it? In 1939, a psychological experiment took place at the University of Iowa. It would later be called the Monster Study, not by its creators, but by those horrified by what was done. The lead researcher, Wendell Johnson, believed that stuttering wasn't always inborn. He thought it could be learned, not through trauma, but through suggestion, through fear, through subtle pressure. To test this, his team selected 22 children from an orphanage. Half had speech difficulties. The others spoke normally. And it was the normal-speaking children who were targeted. They were told, quietly but firmly, that their speech was flawed, that they were beginning to stutter, that they needed to watch themselves. Every hesitation was pointed out. Every word was scrutinized. The children began to break down. Some became silent. Some developed speech anxiety. Some began to stutter where there had been no stutter before. There was no violence, no machines, just trusted adults, repeating carefully chosen words. Over time, those words rewired the children's self-image. Their confidence collapsed. They didn't know they were part of an experiment. No one told them it wasn't real, and no one came back to undo it. This study became one of the most quietly cruel examples of what psychology can do when ethics disappear. It revealed something terrifying, that a child's mind can be reshaped with nothing more than repeated suggestion. That identity, especially at a young age, is fragile, moldable, and easily broken. It didn't take pain. It didn't take isolation. It just took the right voice, saying the wrong thing, often enough. And once that seed of doubt was planted, the damage grew quietly. The Little Albert Experiment, 1920. Conditioning a baby to fear everything. Imagine being afraid of something, but not knowing why. Imagine that fear was planted in your mind before you could even speak. That's what happened to a baby known as Little Albert. In 1920, psychologist John B. Watson wanted to prove that fear wasn't just something you were born with. It could be installed, like software, installed by someone who knew how. Albert was 9 months old. At first, he played calmly with a white rat. No fear, no hesitation. But then, something changed. Each time the rat appeared, the researchers struck a steel bar behind Albert's head. The sound was sudden and terrifying. Albert cried, and within a few sessions, he began to associate the harmless rat with the jarring noise. Soon, just seeing the rat was enough to make him cry. Then it spread. He reacted to rabbits, dogs, cotton, even a Santa Claus mask. Anything soft, anything white, anything even remotely similar. The fear had generalized. His brain had made the connection. This thing equals danger. And from there, everything that resembled it became part of the threat. There was no comfort, no reversal. The researchers never taught him to feel safe again. They never undid the fear they created. This study crossed a line. It used a child, without consent, to show how fragile the human mind is, how quickly it learns to fear, and how easily that fear can attach to innocent things. What disturbed psychologists wasn't just the result. It was the simplicity. A few sessions, a few sounds, and a child's emotional world was altered. It showed us that fear can be engineered, quietly, deliberately, permanently. And the most chilling part, we still don't know what happened to Albert. He was never followed up. No one knows if those fears stayed with him into adulthood. All we know is that something pure was replaced with something manufactured. Milgram's obedience experiment, 1961. Shocking people into submission. If someone told you to hurt another person, would you do it? Not because you're cruel, but because someone in authority said it was necessary. That question haunted Stanley Milgram in the early 1960s. The world had just witnessed the horrors of the Holocaust. Ordinary people had carried out unthinkable orders. And everyone kept asking the same question. How? Milgram believed the answer wasn't in ideology. It was in obedience. So he designed an experiment. Participants were told they were part of a study on learning and memory. They were the teacher. Another person, the learner, sat in a separate room. If the learner answered a question incorrectly, the teacher would deliver an electric shock, increasing the voltage each time. The learner, of course, was an actor. No shocks were ever delivered, but the teacher didn't know that. As the shocks increased, the learner screamed, then begged, then fell silent. Many participants hesitated. They looked uncomfortable. Some protested, but a man in a lab coat, standing beside them, simply said, "Please continue." And most did. 65% of participants went all the way to the highest setting. They believed they were inflicting severe pain, or even death, and they still obeyed. Milgram's experiment didn't reveal sadism. It revealed submission. Most people didn't enjoy what they were doing, but they kept going because someone in a position of power told them it was okay. It didn't take rage. It didn't take hatred. It took instruction. Quiet, controlled, authoritative. And that's what disturbed everyone the most. The people pressing those buttons weren't monsters. They were ordinary, respectable, thoughtful. They cried. They sweated. But they obeyed. Milgram had pulled back the curtain on something very real. Our tendency to defer. To follow orders. Even when we know they're wrong. Not because we want to do harm, but because we don't want to resist. The Stanford Prison Experiment, 1971. Students become sadistic guards. What would you become if no one told you to stop? In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo set out to explore how people behave when placed in a position of unchecked power. To do this, he turned the basement of Stanford University's psychology building into a simulated prison. He recruited 24 healthy, educated college students. Randomly, they were assigned roles. Half would be guards. Half would be prisoners. There were no real crimes. No real sentences. But once the simulation began, the lines between reality and role started to dissolve. The guards were given uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, and permission to run the prison as they saw fit, within limits. At first, they were awkward, unsure, but within hours, the behavior shifted. The guards began enforcing rules aggressively. Some became hostile. They humiliated the prisoners, isolated them, forced them into stress positions, deprived them of sleep, laughed while doing it. The prisoners broke down. They cried. They rebelled. Then they gave up. They started following commands that didn't make sense. Their identities began to erode. Some began referring to themselves only by their prisoner number. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It was shut down after 6 days. What disturbed people wasn't just how fast it escalated. It was how completely the participants adapted to their roles. Normal students, with no history of violence or instability, became cruel when given power. And others, with no record of submission, became passive when placed under authority. Zimbardo himself got lost in the experiment. As the supervising psychologist, he didn't stop the abuse. He watched it unfold. Only when a colleague confronted him did he realize how far it had gone. The Stanford Prison Experiment didn't just show that power corrupts. It showed that situations, not personality, often shape behavior. That the roles we're assigned can override who we think we are. And it left behind a haunting truth. Put the right person in the wrong place, and they might never act the same again. The Aversion Project, 1970s. South Africa. Electric shocks to cure homosexuality. What happens when medicine is used as a weapon, not to heal, but to punish? During the 1970s in apartheid-era South Africa, a government-backed program was launched under the guise of psychiatric treatment. It was called the Aversion Project. Its aim was to correct the sexual orientation of men in the military who were suspected of being gay. Thousands of young soldiers were sent to military psychiatric wards, many against their will. Once inside, they were subjected to chemical castration, hormone treatments, and, most disturbingly, aversion therapy. This included showing them homoerotic imagery and then administering electric shocks while the images were displayed. The intention was clear: create a link between same-sex attraction and physical pain. The project didn't stop at psychological conditioning. In many cases, doctors recommended full gender reassignment as a way to remove homosexual behavior, sometimes without consent. People were medically altered without understanding what was being done to them. This wasn't just a psychological experiment. It was systemic abuse cloaked in scientific authority, and it was carried out by licensed doctors, following a government directive. The underlying psychology here is chilling. The same behavioral principles used in animal training, stimulus and punishment, were used to try to erase identity. It wasn't about understanding the mind. It was about breaking it. Many of the victims were left permanently altered, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Some never spoke about it. Some disappeared. The Aversion Project stands as a brutal reminder of what can happen when psychology is stripped of ethics, when ideology uses science as a tool for control, and when the goal isn't healing, but erasure. The Landis Facial Expression Study, 1924. Forced decapitation of rats. How far will someone go? Just because a researcher asks them to. In 1924, psychologist Carney Landis set out to study human facial expressions. He wanted to know whether emotions produced universal facial reactions, if disgust, fear, or surprise looked the same from one person to another. To test this, he recruited college students and subjected them to a series of disturbing experiences. They were exposed to strong smells, shocking images, live animals, all while their faces were painted with markings and photographed throughout, to capture every twitch and shift in expression. But then came the final test. Each student was handed a live rat, and then they were asked politely to decapitate it. Many refused at first. They hesitated, but when Landis insisted, most complied. They didn't want to. They weren't trained. But still, they followed the instruction. Some wept. Some apologized to the animal. But they did it. What Landis discovered had little to do with facial muscles. What he had unintentionally revealed was something much darker. The power of authority to override personal ethics. The willingness of ordinary people to do something horrific, simply because a figure in a lab coat asked them to. The experiment was later criticized heavily for its lack of scientific value. The results were inconsistent. The expressions couldn't be meaningfully categorized. The decapitations didn't yield any useful psychological data. But what it did show was how quickly moral discomfort can be pushed aside in the presence of institutional authority. That even when people are visibly disturbed, they often still obey. It was meant to be about the face, but it ended up revealing what lies behind it. The Bobo doll experiment, 1961. Teaching violence through television. What if the violence we see becomes the violence we repeat? In 1961, psychologist Albert Bandura designed an experiment to explore how children learn by watching others. The focus wasn't on punishment or reward, it was on imitation. Can simply observing a behavior, without participating in it, cause a child to repeat it later? To test this, Bandura brought young children into a controlled setting. Some of them watched an adult, calm and smiling, enter a room with a large inflatable clown-shaped doll known as a Bobo doll. But instead of playing gently, the adult punched the doll, kicked it, hit it with a mallet, and shouted aggressive phrases. The behavior was exaggerated, clearly violent. Later, those children were brought into a room with the same doll. What happened next confirmed Bandura's theory. Many of the children mimicked what they had seen. They hit the doll, kicked it, repeated the same aggressive phrases. Some even found new ways to attack it, things the adult hadn't demonstrated. They weren't acting out of anger. They weren't provoked. They were simply repeating what had been modeled for them. Other children, who hadn't seen the violent demonstration, played calmly. They showed curiosity, not aggression. The difference between the groups was striking. The experiment revealed something critical about human behavior, especially in children. We don't just learn through consequence. We learn by watching. And when the behavior is shown by someone who appears confident, respected, or even cheerful, it sticks. Bandura's study raised difficult questions. If children imitate violence they see in real life, what happens when they see it on TV? In cartoons? In games? In the classroom? The results unsettled many. It suggested that violent behavior didn't need to come from trauma or frustration. It could come from something as simple as watching an adult hit a clown. The human brain, especially when it's young, is wired to copy, to mirror, to repeat what seems normal. And what Bandura quietly proved is that violence, even when it's framed as entertainment, can be absorbed and replayed, sometimes without anyone realizing where it came from. The Pit of Despair, 1970s. Monkeys driven into psychosis. What happens to the mind when it's left completely alone, with no hope of comfort? In the 1970s, psychologist Harry Harlow conducted a series of experiments that would later be known by a name that sounds more like a horror novel than science: the Pit of Despair. Harlow had already gained attention for his work on maternal bonding in monkeys. He had shown that baby monkeys preferred soft, cloth-covered surrogate mothers over cold, mechanical ones that provided food. The conclusion was clear: comfort mattered more than sustenance. But then, Harlow went further. He wanted to explore what happened when that comfort was taken away completely. Not reduced, but removed. Monkeys were placed in a small, vertical chamber. It was made of stainless steel, with no windows, no stimulation, no physical contact, just a sloped floor to prevent lying down. They stayed there for days, some for weeks. What followed was predictable and disturbing. The monkeys became withdrawn. They curled into corners, refused to move. They stopped grooming themselves. Some rocked endlessly. Some lost interest in food. Others became catatonic. When finally removed from isolation, many could not reintegrate. They didn't connect with other monkeys. They didn't seek comfort. Some became aggressive. Others simply stared into space, unresponsive. The chamber had earned its name. Harlow didn't conduct these experiments for cruelty's sake. His goal was to study depression, to create a model for understanding what isolation does to the psyche. But the method and the suffering it caused quickly drew criticism. The Pit of Despair demonstrated something we already sensed, but rarely witnessed so clearly. The mind is not built for total isolation. Without connection, without touch, without reassurance, the brain begins to break down. What's most unsettling is how fast it happened, and how irreversible the effects often were. Harlow had built a machine for psychological destruction, and he had proven that the absence of love, of contact, of even minimal social interaction, is not just painful, it is mind-altering. The Robbers Cave Experiment, 1954. Boys manipulated into tribal warfare. How easy is it to turn us against them, even when nothing real divides us? In 1954, psychologist Muzaffar Sharif ran an experiment that would reveal how quickly and deeply humans divide into groups, and how easily those divisions can spiral into hostility. The study took place at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. 22 boys, around 11 years old, were invited to what they believed was a summer camp. None of them knew they were part of a psychological study. The boys were randomly split into two groups. Each group was kept separate for the first few days. They formed their own identities, chose team names, developed bonds. Then, the researchers introduced competition, baseball, tug-of-war, scavenger hunts, and framed them as battles between rivals. The results were immediate. Hostility flared. The boys began insulting each other. They raided each other's cabins. They burned each other's flags. They refused to eat together. Fistfights broke out, and all of it had been carefully arranged, engineered, by the adults watching from behind the scenes. But the most revealing part came later. The researchers tried to reduce the conflict. First, by bringing the groups together for pleasant activities. It didn't work. The hostility persisted. Then, they introduced shared problems, a broken water system, a stuck food truck, tasks that could only be solved if both groups worked together. Slowly, the barriers broke down. What this study revealed was both disturbing and hopeful. It showed that group identity can be created quickly, even with no real differences. That competition escalates division, and that people will protect their group, even when the threat is artificial. But it also showed that cooperation, under real pressure, can heal division. The Robbers Cave experiment was not just about children. It was about all of us. How we sort ourselves into categories, how we defend those categories, and how fragile the line is between belonging and conflict. It proved that tribalism doesn't require deep differences. It only requires someone to whisper, "They are not like you." David Reimer case, 1965. Gender reassignment gone tragically wrong. What happens when identity is decided for you, before you ever get a chance to understand who you are? In 1965, a baby boy named Bruce Reimer was born in Canada. At 8 months old, during a routine circumcision, a surgical accident destroyed his penis. His parents, terrified and unsure, reached out to a psychologist named Dr. John Money. He was a rising figure in the field of gender identity and believed, firmly, that gender was not something innate, but something learned. Dr. Money suggested an extreme solution. Raise Bruce as a girl, surgically alter his body, change his name, dress him differently, and never tell him the truth. Bruce became Brenda. Throughout childhood, Dr. Money used Brenda as a case study to support his theory that nurture, not nature, determines gender. The experiment was presented as a success. He reported that Brenda was adapting well, that she identified as female, that the reassignment had worked. But the truth was hidden. Privately, Brenda was miserable. She resisted wearing dresses. She refused stereotypical female behavior. She was bullied, withdrawn, and angry, and she didn't know why. Therapy sessions with Dr. Money were invasive and often traumatic, involving forced discussions and rehearsals of gender roles. But still, the truth was kept from her. At age 14, Brenda was told the full story, and everything unraveled. She rejected the female identity, changed her name to David, and began living as a male. But the psychological damage had already been done. He struggled with depression, anxiety, and a deep sense of betrayal. His twin brother, who had also been part of the study, suffered as well. Years later, he died by overdose. 2 years after that, David Reimer died by suicide. This wasn't just a medical tragedy. It was a psychological one. A child had been turned into an experiment. His identity was overwritten, not with understanding, but with theory. And it revealed something many didn't want to face. That identity, especially gender identity, may not be easily rewritten from the outside. The David Reimer case shattered the idea that nurture alone could override biology. And it left behind one of the most heartbreaking examples of what happens when science ignores the individual in favor of the model. It didn't begin with cruelty, but it ended with it. The Good Samaritan Experiment, 1973. Who helps, and who walks away? Why do some people stop to help, while others pretend not to see? In 1973, psychologists John Darley and Daniel Batson set up an experiment at Princeton Theological Seminary, a place where future ministers were being trained to preach morality, compassion, and service to others. But the goal of the experiment wasn't about sermons. It was about behavior. The students were told they would be giving a short talk in another building. Some were asked to speak about the story of the Good Samaritan, the biblical tale of a man who helps a wounded stranger by the side of the road. Others were told to speak on unrelated topics. Before heading to the next building, each student was given a time condition. Some were told they had plenty of time. Others were told they were late and needed to hurry. Along the path to the other building, The researchers planted an actor, slumped in a doorway, coughing, clearly in distress. He didn't speak. He didn't beg. He just looked like he needed help. What the researchers found was sobering. The topic of the speech didn't matter. Whether a student was about to preach about the Good Samaritan or not made little difference. What mattered was time. Those who believed they were running late were far less likely to stop. Some even stepped over the man. Others offered a quick glance and kept walking. Only those who felt they had time were significantly more likely to stop and help. It wasn't belief. It wasn't values. It was pressure. This experiment quietly exposed the gap between moral identity and actual behavior. We like to think that in moments of crisis, our deeper character will emerge. But what this showed is that small external factors, like being in a rush, can override our values. It wasn't that these students were unkind. Most probably believed in compassion. But in that moment, the sense of urgency short-circuited their awareness. The Good Samaritan experiment forced psychology to confront something uncomfortable. That morality is often fragile. That empathy can be silenced by a clock. And that what we intend to be may not always show up when it matters most. The Well of Despair, 1970s. Isolation chambers for baby monkeys. What happens when you place a living creature in total isolation and leave it there? This was the question behind one of the most disturbing follow-up studies by Harry Harlow, the same researcher who had created the infamous Pit of Despair. In this version, the focus was even more extreme. In the 1970s, Harlow constructed vertical chambers made of steel, narrow, dark, with slippery sides and no openings. He placed baby monkeys inside. They had already formed bonds with surrogate mothers made of cloth, soft, comforting figures that mimicked maternal touch. But now, all of that was taken away. The monkeys were placed alone. For days, for weeks, for months. No touch, no social cues, no voices, no escape. At first, the monkeys cried. They searched for something to cling to. Then they stopped. They slumped. They rocked. They refused to eat. Their faces went blank. Some developed signs of extreme psychological deterioration. Even after being removed, many never recovered. They couldn't reconnect with other monkeys. Some rejected their own offspring when they became adults. The damage was not temporary. It was total. Harlow wasn't conducting this research to be cruel. His goal was to study the roots of depression. But the method, and its cost, cast a long shadow over the field of psychology. This experiment didn't show us something new. It confirmed something many already feared, that the mind, without connection, begins to collapse. Humans are not so different. Extended isolation, in prisons, in solitary confinement, in neglected children, can leave lifelong psychological scars. What Harlow revealed, however uncomfortably, was the core truth that social beings require contact not as a luxury, but as a survival mechanism. The Well of Despair wasn't just a machine. It was a mirror. Project MKUltra, 1950s, 70s. CIA's mind control nightmare. What if your memories, your thoughts, even your sense of reality, were not entirely your own? During the Cold War, paranoia was everywhere. Governments feared infiltration, ideological warfare, and especially mind control. In that climate, the CIA launched one of the most secretive and disturbing experiments in American history, Project MKUltra. From the 1950s into the 1970s, the agency conducted hundreds of classified experiments on unwitting individuals. The goal was simple, yet terrifying, to explore whether the human mind could be broken and reprogrammed. Could drugs, trauma, and manipulation create new personalities? Could truth be extracted without consent? Could a person be turned into a puppet? LSD was at the center of it all. The CIA administered it to prisoners, psychiatric patients, military personnel, and everyday citizens, often without their knowledge. They observed the results in hotel rooms wired with microphones, under one-way mirrors, in military hospitals. Some participants were told they were part of health trials. Others were told nothing at all. But MKUltra went far beyond drugs. Subjects were exposed to electroshock therapy at extreme levels, sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, hypnosis. In some cases, people were dosed with hallucinogens for days or weeks, kept in darkness, and stripped of any sense of time or identity. Many never fully recovered. Some lost touch with reality permanently. Others committed suicide. Records were destroyed. Families were never told what really happened. And for decades, it was all denied. The psychological theory behind MKUltra was based on a bleak idea that if you can destroy the personality, you can build a new one from the ground up. But what the CIA learned was more sobering. The human mind is not so easily rebuilt. Once broken, it often stays that way. MKUltra didn't yield reliable mind control, but it proved how fragile the mind can be when subjected to enough stress, confusion, and fear. It also revealed how quickly ethics disappear when fear takes control of science. By the time the program was exposed in the 1970s, most of the documents had been destroyed. What remains is only a glimpse of how far a government was willing to go to control the human mind. Rosenhan Experiment, 1973. Faking insanity to expose psychiatry. What if you were perfectly sane, but no one believed you? In 1973, psychologist David Rosenhan set out to test the reliability of psychiatric diagnoses. His method was bold and deeply unsettling. He and 7 others, all mentally healthy, presented themselves at different psychiatric hospitals across the United States. Each one reported hearing a single, fabricated symptom, a voice saying the word empty, or thud. That was it. All 8 were admitted. Once inside, they behaved completely normally. They answered questions honestly. They reported no symptoms. And yet, not one was recognized as sane. Instead, they were labeled with schizophrenia, with bipolar disorder, with other serious diagnoses. The average stay was 19 days. One person remained hospitalized for almost 2 months. Doctors continued to observe the patients through a distorted lens. Normal behaviors, like writing notes or pacing the hall, were interpreted as signs of mental illness. Even attempts to discuss the misunderstanding were seen as symptoms of denial or paranoia. None were discharged as healthy. They were released with diagnoses marked in remission. Rosenhan's experiment exposed a deep flaw in the system that once labeled. People are seen not as individuals, but as categories. That the medical label can override all other forms of understanding. But the story didn't end there. When one hospital challenged Rosenhan to send more fake patients, he agreed. Over the next few weeks, the hospital flagged 41 individuals as suspected imposters. Rosenhan had sent no one. The experiment revealed a disturbing truth, that the line between sanity and insanity is thinner than we'd like to believe, and that in many psychiatric settings, the diagnosis can become a lens that filters every action, every word, every silence. The Rosenhan experiment didn't just question psychiatric labels. It questioned how society treats people once they're labeled, and it left us with an uneasy reminder. Sometimes, being trapped in the system has nothing to do with what's real, and everything to do with what people are willing to see. Learned Helplessness, 1967. Shocking dogs into hopelessness. At what point does a living being simply stop trying to escape? In the late 1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman conducted a series of experiments that would go on to define a concept now called learned helplessness. It began with dogs. Seligman placed dogs in harnesses and subjected them to mild electric shocks. Some dogs had the ability to stop the shock by pressing a lever or button. Others had no control at all. No matter what they did, the shocks continued. Later, the same dogs were placed in a new environment, a box with a low wall. On one side, they would be shocked. On the other side, they would be safe. The wall was low enough to jump over. The dogs who had learned they could escape jumped. The dogs who had learned they had no control didn't move. They stayed in place. They whimpered. They braced for pain. But they didn't try to escape, even when it was possible. This quiet behavioral shift, the refusal to act, even when the way out was clear, became the foundation of a disturbing insight into the mind. When a creature, human or animal, experiences enough uncontrollable suffering, they can stop believing that escape is even an option. The implications went far beyond dogs. The same patterns were later observed in children, in prisoners, in victims of abuse. When the brain internalizes powerlessness, action shuts down, hope shuts down, even when opportunity returns. The individual doesn't always recognize it. Learned helplessness showed that despair is not just emotional. It's cognitive. It alters what we believe is possible and what we no longer try to change. What Seligman uncovered is now used to understand depression, trauma, and even long-term stress. It's the quiet surrender that doesn't come from weakness, but from repetition, from the belief that nothing we do makes a difference. And that belief, once installed, can be harder to escape than any shock. Operation Midnight Climax, prostitutes, LSD, and surveillance. What happens when trust, privacy, and consent are deliberately removed in the name of science? In the 1950s, the CIA began expanding Project MKUltra, its mind control research initiative, into more covert and ethically disturbing territories. One of those subprojects was called Operation Midnight Climax. It took place in safe houses set up in cities like San Francisco and New York. But these weren't ordinary homes. They were wired with one-way mirrors, hidden microphones, and surveillance equipment. The rooms were managed by federal agents, and the people who entered had no idea they were walking into a psychological trap. Sex workers, hired and paid by the CIA, were instructed to bring men to these locations. Once there, the men were unknowingly dosed with LSD or other psychoactive substances. The purpose was simple: to observe how people behaved under the influence of drugs, in an environment that mimicked real-world intimacy and vulnerability. The men were watched through glass. Everything they said or did was recorded. In some cases, agents sat behind the mirror, sipping martinis, taking notes as the drug effects unfolded. There was no consent, no follow-up, no effort to monitor long-term consequences. Many of the subjects never knew they had been drugged at all, but the psychology behind it was chilling. This wasn't just about LSD. It was about power. The program aimed to study manipulation, control, sexual leverage, and blackmail. How do people behave when they think they're in private, but they're not? How easily can reality be reshaped when the mind is chemically altered, and the setting feels safe? The ethics were non-existent. The people used were not criminals. They weren't volunteers. They were simply available, disposable. The program ran for over a decade. What Operation Midnight Climax revealed wasn't just about psychedelics or espionage. It showed how the very concept of research could be stretched to justify voyeurism, coercion, and experimentation on unwitting civilians. It blurred the line between psychology and surveillance, between science and exploitation, and it remains one of the most quietly invasive chapters in the history of human experimentation. The Blue Eyes/Brown Eyes Experiment, 1968. Racism in a classroom. What happens when a teacher tells you you're inferior, simply because of how you look? The day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, a third-grade teacher in Iowa named Jane Elliott decided to teach her students a lesson they would never forget by creating a controlled environment of discrimination right inside her classroom. She divided her class based on eye color. On the first day, the blue-eyed children were told they were smarter, cleaner, and more trustworthy. They were allowed extra privileges, longer recess, first in line for lunch, positive attention. The brown-eyed children, on the other hand, were told they were lazy, forgetful, and less capable. They had to wear collars to mark them. They were ridiculed when they made mistakes. The psychological effects were immediate. The blue-eyed children became more confident. They interrupted more. They performed better on assignments. The brown-eyed children withdrew. They stumbled over tasks they normally did well. They became anxious and defensive. The next day, the roles were reversed. Now the brown-eyed kids were better. The same behaviors repeated, but in the opposite direction. What Eliot had created wasn't just a simulation. It was a temporary social reality, and it affected the children's behavior, performance, and self-image in just hours. The experiment, later repeated with adults in corporate and academic settings, showed how quickly prejudice could be manufactured, how easy it was to implant superiority and inferiority using nothing more than suggestion and structure. But the most haunting takeaway wasn't just how people behaved when they were oppressed. It was how eagerly they embraced the role of the oppressor when they were given power. This experiment is now widely studied as a demonstration of social conditioning. It shows that discrimination isn't necessarily born, it's taught, reinforced, modeled, and, in many cases, accepted without question. The blue eyes/brown eyes experiment stripped away abstract conversations about racism and made it visible, emotional, and deeply personal. And it reminded us that prejudice doesn't need decades to take root. Sometimes, it only takes a day. Facial feedback hypothesis tests, forcing smiles to see if you feel better. Can your face trick your mind into feeling something that isn't really there? The facial feedback hypothesis is based on a simple but powerful psychological idea that the expression on your face can influence your emotions, that your brain doesn't just control your face can send signals back to your brain. To test this, psychologists conducted a now famous experiment in the 1980s. Participants were given a task, but with a strange requirement. They were asked to hold a pen in their mouths, either between their teeth, which forced the muscles into something resembling a smile, or between their lips, which prevented a smile and mimicked a neutral or frowning expression. Then they were asked to watch cartoon clips and rate how funny they were. The results were subtle but telling. Those whose facial muscles were in the smiling position found the cartoons funnier than those whose faces were more neutral. The researchers concluded that the physical expression had sent feedback to the brain, altering perception and mood, even without the participant being aware of it. But as simple as it sounds, this experiment touched something deeper. It suggested that emotion isn't just internal, it's interactive, that the body and mind are constantly communicating, and that forcing one side can shift the other. Later studies expanded the idea. People forced to frown while watching sad content reported feeling more disturbed. People who walked with slouched posture reported lower confidence. What we do with our bodies echoes in our thoughts, but the findings have remained controversial. Some replications failed. Others showed only slight effects, and it raised new questions. If emotion can be influenced externally, how stable is it? How much of what we feel is truly our own? And how much is being fed to us through environment, habit, or even mimicry? The facial feedback hypothesis didn't involve trauma, drugs, or isolation, but it quietly questioned something most of us take for granted, that our emotions are private and internal. And it suggested a stranger truth, that your smile might not just reflect your feelings, it might be writing them. The Asch Conformity Experiments, 1951. Going along with the wrong answer. What if everyone around you said something clearly wrong? Would you still speak the truth? In the early 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch conducted one of the most famous social psychology experiments of all time. His goal was to understand how people respond when their own perception clashes with that of the group. What he uncovered was a quiet but powerful instinct, the need to conform. The setup was simple. Participants believed they were part of a visual perception test. They were shown a line, and then asked to choose which of 3 comparison lines matched its length. The answer was obvious. Anyone could see it. But there was a twist. Each participant was seated in a group with 7 others. What they didn't know was that the others were actors, instructed to give the wrong answer on certain trials. At first, the participant gave the correct answer with confidence. But after hearing multiple people all agree on the same clearly wrong choice, something started to shift. Many participants began to second-guess themselves. Some went along with the group, even when they knew the answer was wrong. Others sat quietly, anxious and unsure, afraid to stand out. The results were unsettling. Over 1/3 of the participants conformed to the group's incorrect answer, despite the evidence in front of their eyes. When questioned afterward, they admitted they hadn't believed the group, but had feared being the only one who disagreed. The Asch conformity experiments showed just how much social pressure can distort perception and suppress dissent. It wasn't about intellect. It wasn't about vision. It was about fear, the quiet fear of isolation, of embarrassment, of being the only one. This wasn't a test of intelligence. It was a test of courage. And for many, the pressure to blend in was stronger than the urge to be right. The psychology of conformity revealed by Asch remains just as relevant today. In classrooms, workplaces, politics, and online spaces, it reminds us that even when we think we're making independent decisions, we might only be echoing the room around us. The Marshmallow Test, 1972, delayed gratification in children. How much of your future is shaped by what you can resist as a child? In 1972, psychologist Walter Mischel conducted a now iconic study on delayed gratification at Stanford University. A test so simple it almost seemed like a game. But its implications would shape how we think about self-control for decades. Children were brought into a room one at a time. On the table in front of them sat a single marshmallow. The instructions were clear. If you can wait 15 minutes without eating it, you'll get 2 marshmallows instead of 1. Then the researcher left the room. The child was alone, facing a test of patience and temptation. Some children stared at the marshmallow. Some sniffed it. Some picked it up and held it close. Others turned their chairs around, covered their eyes, or sang to themselves, anything to distract from the pull of instant reward. Some ate the marshmallow within minutes. Others lasted the full 15. But the most revealing part of the experiment came years later. Mischel followed up with the children as they grew. He found a correlation. Those who had resisted the marshmallow tended to have better academic performance, stronger emotional regulation, and higher life satisfaction. Those who had eaten it quickly were more likely to struggle with attention, planning, and stress. The marshmallow test was interpreted as a window into willpower, the ability to delay reward for a greater gain. But over time, the interpretation grew more complex. Critics pointed out that children from less stable households were more likely to eat the marshmallow, not because they lacked discipline, but because they had learned not to trust promises. In an unpredictable environment, taking what's available now might not be impatience. It might be survival. The test, once seen as a measure of character, became a mirror reflecting deeper truths about trust, socioeconomic background, and how early experiences shape how we manage desire. It wasn't just about a treat. It was about how the future begins in the quiet decisions we make when no one is watching. The Clark doll test, 1940s. Internalized racism in children. At what age do children learn to hate their own reflection? In the 1940s, psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark conducted a study that would later be used in one of the most important civil rights decisions in U.S. history. The experiment was simple but devastating. African American children, aged 3 to 7, were shown 2 dolls, one white, one black. They were asked a series of questions. Which doll is the nice doll? Which one is the bad doll? Which one would you like to play with? Which doll looks like you? Again and again, the children pointed to the white doll as the good one and the black doll as the bad one, even when asked which doll looked like them. Many black children hesitated and chose the white doll instead. The results were deeply unsettling. These weren't teenagers shaped by years of media or school. These were children, some barely out of toddlerhood, who had already absorbed messages about worth, beauty, and goodness. Messages that told them who was valuable and who was not. The Clark doll test didn't measure intelligence. It didn't measure behavior. It measured internalized belief, the quiet, painful absorption of social prejudice into self-perception. The study became a key piece of evidence in Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court case that ended legal school segregation in the United States. The justices recognized that segregation didn't just divide, it damaged. It wasn't about access to books or buildings. It was about identity. The Clark doll test revealed that racism isn't just something taught through slurs or violence. Sometimes, it's learned through silence, through absence, through images, through the quiet ways the world tells you who matters. And for the children in this study, that lesson had already been learned far too early. Third Wave Experiment, 1967. Creating a fascist movement in a high school. How easily can people fall into authoritarian thinking if you just give them a leader? In 1967, high school history teacher Ron Jones was trying to help his students understand how the German population had followed the rise of fascism during World War II. Many of them believed they wouldn't have been part of it. They said things like that could never happen here. So Jones decided to create an experiment. He called it the Third Wave. It began with simple rules. Students were told to sit in perfect posture, to stand when speaking, to use respectful formal greetings. Jones emphasized discipline, community, and strength. At first, it felt like a classroom management strategy, but it quickly grew into something else. Jones invented a symbol for the movement. He gave it slogans. He created a salute. Within days, students began recruiting others. They reported classmates who didn't follow the rules. They stopped asking questions. They started showing loyalty, not just to the idea, but to Jones himself. By the third day, over 200 students were involved. They believed this was real, that they were part of a powerful new movement. When Jones revealed that it had all been an experiment, that there was no third wave, no actual organization, many students were devastated. Some cried. Some were angry. Others sat in silence. The entire thing had lasted just 5 days. The experiment showed how quickly people, even teenagers, could fall into patterns of authoritarian behavior when given structure, identity, and a sense of belonging. The students weren't forced. They were invited, and they accepted the invitation eagerly. Jones hadn't expected the intensity. He ended the experiment early because it felt like it had gone too far, too fast. The third wave revealed that fascism isn't always imposed. Sometimes, it grows from the inside, through the need for order, unity, and purpose. And it reminded us that even in peaceful environments, the seeds of control and blind obedience can sprout within days. Not in another country, not in history, but in an ordinary classroom. Turing's chemical castration, 1952. Punishing genius through psychology. What if society decided your mind was brilliant, but your body needed to be punished? Alan Turing was one of the most important figures of the 20th century. A mathematician, a codebreaker, a pioneer of computer science. His work during World War II helped crack Nazi encryption systems and shorten the war. But in 1952, none of that protected him. He was arrested for being gay. Homosexuality was a criminal offense in the United Kingdom at the time. When Turing admitted to a relationship with another man, he was charged with gross indecency. The court gave him a choice: prison or hormone therapy. He chose what was called chemical castration. For the next year, Turing was subjected to synthetic estrogen injections. The treatment lowered his libido, altered his body, and came with significant psychological and physical side effects. His body changed. He developed breast tissue. He became depressed, isolated, There was no counseling, no medical support, no ethics committee. It was framed as therapy, but it was punishment. It wasn't meant to help. It was meant to erase a part of who he was. 2 years later, Turing was found dead from cyanide poisoning, an apparent suicide. He was 41. The psychological damage inflicted by the so-called treatment wasn't limited to discomfort. It was existential. Turing, a man who had decoded machines, was broken by a system that saw his identity as an illness. This wasn't an isolated case. Thousands of men across Europe and North America were subjected to similar corrective treatments. It was often labeled as psychological rehabilitation, but in reality, it was a medicalized form of shame and control. Turing's story is now widely remembered, not just for his brilliance, but for the cruelty he endured. In 2009, the British government issued a formal apology. In 2013, he was posthumously pardoned, but the psychological experiment had already happened, not in a lab, but in a courtroom, and it left behind a devastating legacy that even the brightest minds can be destroyed, not by war or disease, but by policy and prejudice. Monkey Drug Trials, 1969. Addicting animals to heroin and meth. What does addiction look like when no one's trying to stop it? In 1969, researchers conducted a series of animal trials to better understand drug dependency, using monkeys as their test subjects. The methods were simple, but deeply disturbing. Monkeys were trained to self-administer various drugs, including heroin, morphine, amphetamines, cocaine, and alcohol. Once trained, they were left alone in their cages with access to unlimited supplies. No restrictions, no intervention. The researchers watched what happened next. Some monkeys injected themselves repeatedly until they collapsed. Others refused food and water, focusing only on the drug. Some tore out their own fur. Some broke their limbs from compulsive, erratic movement. One monkey, given cocaine, continued pressing the lever until it died. Others experienced seizures, hallucinations, and violent withdrawal symptoms. The behavior didn't take long to appear. In many cases, it took only hours or days for full-blown addiction to develop. The monkeys weren't forced, but once they discovered the effect, they kept going, even when it hurt, even when it led to death. The experiment was designed to mirror human addiction. It revealed how quickly the brain's reward system can be hijacked by chemicals. It showed that addiction isn't about weakness, it's about biology. Once the brain is rewired to chase a high, rational behavior often disappears. But it also raised serious ethical questions. The monkeys didn't consent. They weren't treated or rehabilitated. They were simply observed as their bodies and minds deteriorated. The suffering was profound, and many psychologists criticized the study for its cruelty, even as others pointed to its scientific value. What the monkey drug trials showed, above all, was how powerful and destructive addiction can be when left unchecked. The drive to repeat pleasure can override everything else: safety, health, even survival. And it asked a difficult question. If this is what happens to a monkey, isolated and unprotected, what happens to a human when they're alone with their pain? Bogus Pipeline, 1971. Forcing truth with a fake lie detector. What would you admit if you believed a machine already knew the truth? In 1971, psychologists developed a device known as the Bogus Pipeline, a fake lie detector designed not to record truth, but to extract it. The idea was simple but psychologically sharp. If people believe they're being monitored by something scientific and infallible, they're more likely to be honest. Participants were connected to wires and sensors. The machine buzzed, blinked, and clicked. Electrodes were placed on their arms and hands. They were told this device could detect lies by monitoring their physiological responses. But in reality, the machine didn't measure anything. It was all for show. Then the questions began about prejudice, addiction, cheating, personal behaviors, and social biases. questions people typically lie about in surveys. And suddenly, the answers changed. People who had previously denied racist beliefs now admitted them. Those who minimized their substance use acknowledged more. Subjects revealed more intimate truths, not because they were forced to, but because they believed resistance was futile. Even women who had carefully managed how they were perceived, in public settings or on paper, let their guard down under the illusion of being seen by something that couldn't be deceived. The machine didn't intimidate them. It disarmed them. What the Bogus Pipeline revealed wasn't about lie detection. It was about the psychology of self-presentation. How much of what we say is shaped not by honesty, but by how we want to be seen. When people believe there's no use in lying, they speak differently. But the darker implication wasn't just about honesty. It was about control. This fake machine shaped people's disclosures. It changed their behavior through nothing more than belief. It proved that perception of surveillance, not actual surveillance, was often enough to extract confession. And it raised uncomfortable questions about how much of what we say, even to ourselves, is a performance. The Bogus Pipeline didn't uncover truth. It manufactured the conditions for it. The Crayon Box Test, 1983. When children realize minds are separate. At what age do we realize that other people don't think the way we do? In the 1980s, researchers studying child development began asking young children a deceptively simple question. One that would quietly reveal the moment a mind first grasps the existence of other minds. A child is shown a crayon box. The researcher opens it. Inside, not crayons, but candles. The box is then closed. The researcher asks, "What do you think is inside the box?" The child says crayons. Then the researcher opens the box again to remind her. It's actually candles. Now comes the key question. What will your friend think is in the box? If the child is very young, around age 3, she will say candles. She assumes everyone sees what she sees. Her brain hasn't yet developed the concept of false belief. The idea that someone else can believe something that she knows to be untrue. But by age 4 or 5, children begin to answer differently. They say crayons. They understand now that their friend hasn't seen the inside of the box. They recognize that someone else can hold a belief that differs from reality. This is the moment psychologists call the emergence of theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have their own thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and misunderstandings. It may sound innocent, but this developmental milestone is profound. It marks the beginning of empathy, deception, guilt, manipulation, compassion. Once we understand that others can be misled, we also understand how to lie. Once we realize others can hurt, we begin to comfort or exploit. And while this test was designed for children, it has implications for adults as well. Those with certain neurological conditions, like autism spectrum disorder or schizophrenia, often struggle with theory of mind. It shapes how they interpret others' intentions, humor, or sarcasm. The Crayon Box Test wasn't about crayons. It was about the boundary between the self and the other. And the moment a child begins to see that she is not the center of the universe, it's a quiet psychological threshold. And once it's crossed, there's no going back. False memory implantation, 1995. Creating a childhood that never happened. Can someone convince you that something traumatic happened to you when it never did? In the 1990s, psychologist Elizabeth Loftus conducted a study that shook the foundations of memory science. Her question was unsettling. Can false memories be implanted so deeply that a person believes them without doubt? To find out, she designed an experiment involving close family members. Participants were told a list of childhood events, most true, one completely fabricated. In some cases, it was a simple falsehood. You got lost in the mall when you were 5. The subject was asked to recall the details. Most denied it at first, but over the course of several interviews, something strange began to happen. A few participants started to remember. They described the mall. They recalled the panic. One said a kind woman helped her find her parents. Another described the smell of the food court. These memories felt real. But they weren't. They had been planted gently, but deliberately. Loftus found that around 25% of people could be convinced of an event that never occurred, if it was suggested repeatedly and framed as something their family remembered. The psychological implications were staggering. It meant memory was not just fragile, it was editable. This had enormous consequences for everything from therapy to the legal system. If memories could be planted through suggestion, what did that mean for eyewitness testimony? For recovered memories in trauma cases? For the stories we tell ourselves? Loftus was criticized, sometimes harshly, for the ethical risks of manipulating memory. But her work exposed something most people don't want to hear: that the mind doesn't store events like a hard drive. It reconstructs. It fills gaps. And sometimes, it inserts fiction where there was once nothing. False memory implantation showed that the mind can be persuaded, not just to believe, but to remember. And if you remember it, it becomes your truth. The Case of Genie, 1970. A girl raised in silence and darkness. What happens to a mind that's never allowed to speak? In 1970, a 13-year-old girl was discovered in Los Angeles. Her name was Jeannie, a pseudonym, chosen to protect her identity. She had been confined to a small room her entire life, often strapped to a child's toilet or tied inside a sleeping bag. Jeannie had been deprived of almost all human interaction. She had never learned to speak. She had never been allowed to play. For most of her childhood, she had been completely isolated. When authorities found her, she was underweight, frail, and silent. She walked awkwardly. She spat. She couldn't chew solid food. But what shocked psychologists most was her lack of language. She could barely form words. She had no understanding of grammar. Researchers saw an opportunity, a disturbing one. They wondered, could she still learn language? Was there a critical period that had already passed? Jeannie became the center of a deeply controversial research effort. Linguists, psychologists, neurologists, they all studied her, measured her, recorded her responses. For a brief time, she made progress. She learned vocabulary. She developed some social skills. But over time, the attention faded. Funding was pulled. The researchers moved on. Jeannie was moved between foster homes, where she reportedly suffered further abuse. Eventually, she stopped speaking altogether. The psychological damage had been too deep. Jeannie's case raised profound ethical questions. She was a victim, but also a subject. A child, but also an experiment. Was the research truly for her benefit, or for the curiosity of those studying her? Her life became a grim reflection of what happens when connection is withheld. She had never been taught love, language, or comfort, and when the world finally opened up to her, it didn't last. The Case of Genie remains one of the most heartbreaking examples in developmental psychology. It revealed how crucial early interaction is for the human mind, and how devastating the absence of it can be. She wasn't born broken. She was made that way, by silence. The Invisible Gorilla Experiment, 1999. Missing what's right in front of you. How much of reality are we truly seeing, even when our eyes are open? In 1999, psychologists Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons designed a simple experiment that would expose something deeply flawed in the way we perceive the world. It's now known as the Invisible Gorilla Experiment. Participants were asked to watch a video. Two teams, one in white shirts, the other in black, passed basketballs back and forth. The task was clear. Count how many times the white team passes the ball. Viewers focused hard. They counted carefully. Then came the twist. In the middle of the video, a person in a full gorilla suit walked into the frame. He paused, beat his chest, then walked out. Later, the participants were asked a question. Did you see the gorilla? About half said no. They had been so focused on the ball passes, on the specific task they were given, that their brains completely ignored something absurd happening right in front of them. This phenomenon is called inattentional blindness. It's not about poor vision or low intelligence. It's about how attention shapes perception. When the brain locks onto one thing, it filters out everything else, even the unexpected, even the obvious. The invisible gorilla experiment was unsettling because it didn't reveal a small flaw. It revealed a fundamental limit in awareness. We assume we see more than we do. We trust our senses. But the brain doesn't record everything. It selects, it discards, and it misses things, even things in gorilla suits. In real life, this has serious consequences. Drivers fail to see pedestrians. Surgeons miss instruments left inside patients. Witnesses swear they saw something. That never happened. And the worst part, we rarely notice what we've missed. The experiment didn't just demonstrate a trick of attention. It revealed something deeper. That the world we believe we see is often just a sliver of what's actually there. And we'll never know what we didn't see. Heider-Simmel Illusion, 1944. Seeing stories where there are none. Why do we see emotions in things that have none? In 1944, psychologists Fritz Heider and Marion Simmel created a short animated film. It featured simple shapes, a large triangle, a small triangle, and a circle moving across a two-dimensional screen. There were no words, no faces, no context, and yet almost every viewer saw a story. They described the big triangle as aggressive, the small triangle as timid, the circle as flirtatious or playful. Some said the big triangle was bullying the others. Others imagined the circle trying to escape. Some described fear, jealousy, or even romance. None of it was in the animation. It was all in the mind. This experiment revealed a powerful human tendency called anthropomorphism, our instinct to assign human traits to non-human things. Not just emotions, but motives, intentions, relationships. It's why we name our cars. It's why we talk to our computers. It's why we look at clouds and see faces. The Heider-Simmel animation didn't have characters. It had shapes. But the mind filled in the rest because it's wired to find meaning, even where none exists. This tendency can be charming. It can create connection and imagination. But it also has a dark side. It's how people misinterpret random events as personal attacks. It's how conspiracy theories form. It's how we assign blame or credit to systems that are neutral. It's how we see danger in shadows. The illusion showed that perception isn't passive. It's a narrative engine. And once we assign emotion or motive to a moving object, even a triangle, we believe the story we've invented. The Heider-Simmel experiment proved something quietly disturbing. That reality isn't just what we see, it's what we believe we're seeing. And sometimes, the mind prefers a fiction that feels human over a truth that feels empty. Pavlov's dogs, 1890s. Teaching the body to obey bells. What if your body could be trained to react, without your mind even knowing why? In the late 1890s, Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov wasn't trying to uncover anything psychological. He was studying digestion, observing how dogs salivate in response to food. But what he noticed changed the field of psychology forever. The dogs began salivating not just when food was placed in front of them, but when they heard the footsteps of the lab assistant bringing it. So Pavlov decided to test this. He rang a bell before each feeding. Again and again, the same routine, bell, then food, bell, then food, until finally, the bell was enough. The dogs began to salivate at the sound alone, even when no food followed. They weren't thinking. They weren't deciding. Their bodies had learned to react. This phenomenon became known as classical conditioning, when a neutral stimulus becomes associated with a biological response. Pavlov had shown that the brain could form connections below the level of awareness. The bell didn't cause hunger. It caused expectation. The body responded as if something was real, simply because of what it had come to expect. Later, this framework was used in advertising, habit formation, phobias, trauma recovery, and even behavioral therapy. It explained why a song might bring tears, or why a certain smell could trigger anxiety. The stimulus wasn't the cause, it was the signal. What was once just a bell became a door to the subconscious. The darker implication? Conditioning can happen without consent, without awareness, without understanding. A person can be trained to feel fear, comfort, or longing, not through logic, but through repetition. Pavlov's dogs didn't choose to salivate. Their bodies made the decision for them. And the rest of us aren't so different. Milgram's shock experiment, 1961. Obedience to authority over morality. Would you hurt someone just because a man in a lab coat told you to? In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted one of the most haunting studies in social psychology. His question was simple, but heavy. How far will people go in obeying authority, even when it means harming another person? Participants were told they were part of a learning experiment. They were assigned the role of teacher, while another participant, actually an actor, played the learner, seated in another room. The teacher's job was to administer an electric shock every time the learner gave a wrong answer. With each mistake, the voltage increased. In reality, there were no shocks, but the actor responded as if there were groaning, screaming, begging for it to stop. At 150 volts, he demanded to be released. At 300 volts, he pounded the wall. At 450 volts, he went silent. A stern man in a lab coat stood beside the real participant, calmly saying, "The experiment requires that you continue." And most did. 65% of participants continued all the way to the maximum voltage, despite their own hesitation, despite visible signs of distress, despite believing they were seriously harming someone. Why? Milgram concluded that obedience to perceived authority often overrides personal conscience. The lab coat, the setting, the language, it all created a psychological pressure that made people defer responsibility. The experiment wasn't about sadism. Most participants weren't cruel. They were anxious, reluctant. Some cried, some trembled. But they continued because someone they saw as legitimate told them to. Milgram's study revealed a chilling truth. You don't need monsters to commit harm. Just ordinary people in the wrong structure, with the right pressure. And the scariest part? Many of them said afterward that they weren't to blame. They were just following orders. Skinner's box, 1930s. Controlling behavior with rewards. How much of your life is shaped by invisible rewards you never questioned? In the 1930s and 40s, psychologist B.F. Skinner created a device that would change behavioral science forever. It was called the operant conditioning chamber, but most people know it as Skinner's box. It was simple, a small chamber where a rat or pigeon could press a lever to receive food. Skinner observed how the animal learned. When pressing the lever led to food, the behavior increased. When there was no reward, the behavior stopped. He introduced schedules. Sometimes food came every time. Sometimes only after several presses. Sometimes after unpredictable intervals. And he noticed something strange. When the reward was unpredictable, when the animal didn't know when it would come, the behavior became obsessive. The animal pressed the lever over and over, even without reward, just to chase the possibility. Sound familiar? Skinner's work laid the foundation for behavioral reinforcement, shaping actions through reward and punishment. It's now used in everything from parenting to corporate policy to smartphone app design. When your phone gives you a like, a buzz, or a reward at random, that's a Skinner box in your pocket. The frightening insight is this: behavior can be molded without awareness, without threats, without language, just by controlling feedback. The brain learns what's rewarded and repeats it, often blindly. Skinner believed that free will was largely an illusion, that we are, to a great extent, the sum of our reinforcement history. His box wasn't just for rats. It was for us. The Monster Study, 1939. Tearing down children with words. What happens when you teach a child that their voice is broken. In 1939, a young graduate student named Wendell Johnson at the University of Iowa launched an experiment to study the roots of stuttering. But what began as research turned into psychological harm. The study came to be known, chillingly, as the Monster Study. It involved 22 orphan children. Half of them already had stutters. The other half did not. The children were divided into two groups. One group received positive speech therapy, encouragement, patience, praise. The other group received negative reinforcement, constant correction, criticism, harsh warnings. The goal was to see whether stuttering could be induced, simply by suggesting that something was wrong. For children in the negative group, the results were damaging. They were told their speech was flawed, even when it wasn't. They were made to feel embarrassed for normal disfluencies. Some withdrew. Others grew anxious about speaking. A few began to exhibit real speech problems that hadn't been there before. These were not children with disorders. They were children who had been convinced that they were broken. There was no physical harm, no drugs, no isolation, just words. But the damage lasted for years. The Monster Study was kept secret for decades. It was never published. The university feared backlash. And when the study finally came to light, it was widely condemned. The experiment revealed how powerful suggestion can be, especially when it comes from an authority figure. When you tell a child something is wrong with them, they often believe it. And sometimes, they start to live it. What this study demonstrated brutally was that you don't always need trauma to cause harm. Just the repeated suggestion that something is wrong. A child doesn't just hear the words. She absorbs them. And sometimes, she never fully lets them go. The Hawthorne Effect, 1920s. People change when they're being watched. What if your behavior changes just because someone is watching? In the 1920s and 30s, researchers at the Hawthorne Works factory near Chicago were studying how to increase worker productivity. They tried different lighting levels, break times, and schedules. And with each change, no matter what it was, productivity improved. At first, it seemed like magic. Brighter lights, productivity went up. Dimmer lights, still up. More breaks, up. Fewer breaks, still up. How could every change be effective? Eventually, the researchers realized the truth. It wasn't the changes themselves. It was the fact that the workers knew they were being observed. This became known as the Hawthorne Effect, the tendency for people to alter their behavior simply because they're aware they're being watched. But this effect goes deeper than productivity. It's about self-awareness, identity, performance. When a person feels seen, whether by a boss, a camera, or even a stranger, they behave differently. They monitor themselves. They conform. They exaggerate. Sometimes they improve. Sometimes they hide. The Hawthorne Effect suggests that much of human behavior is not fixed, but contextual. We don't just act, we perform. And the presence of an observer changes the script. This phenomenon has since been observed in medicine, education, law enforcement, and psychology itself. In clinical trials, patients often report improvement just because they know they're being studied. In classrooms, students behave better when they sense surveillance. Even in public spaces, cameras don't just record, they reshape. The unsettling part is that we often don't realize it. We like to think our actions are authentic, but they may simply be adaptations to invisible audiences. The Hawthorne Effect didn't require manipulation, or punishment, or reward, just observation. And sometimes, that's enough to change who we are. Gaslighting Studies, 1944-present. Rewriting reality, one lie at a time. How many lies does it take before you doubt your own mind? The term gaslighting comes from a 1944 film called Gaslight, in which a husband manipulates his wife into believing she's going insane by slowly altering small things in their environment and then denying they ever changed. In psychology, gaslighting became the term for a chilling form of emotional abuse. where one person systematically makes another question their memory, perception, or sanity. While not an experiment in the traditional laboratory sense, gaslighting has been the subject of clinical observation, case studies, and qualitative research for decades, and its psychological effects are some of the most disturbing ever recorded. Victims of gaslighting are often subjected to repeated denial of obvious facts. "You never said that. That never happened. You're just too sensitive." Over time, they start to question themselves. Did she really say it? Was she imagining things? Could she be overreacting? The mind begins to erode. In clinical psychology, gaslighting has been linked to anxiety disorders, depression, PTSD, and a breakdown in self-trust. Victims often become isolated, unsure of what's real. They defer to the gaslighter for clarity. They lose confidence in their own senses. Gaslighting isn't loud. It's quiet, gradual, intentional. In one clinical case, a woman was told daily by her partner that she was forgetful, that she was unstable, that she needed help. There was no evidence, only repetition. Within a year, she had lost her job, withdrawn from friends, and begun to believe she might actually be mentally unwell. Psychologists have studied gaslighting as a form of coercive control, especially in domestic abuse and narcissistic relationships. It's not about anger. It's about power. The goal isn't to argue. It's to dismantle another person's sense of reality. Gaslighting doesn't need proof. It only needs persistence. And when done effectively, it doesn't just change how someone feels. It changes who they are. Bobo doll experiment, 1961. Children learning aggression by watching adults. What if children don't just absorb kindness, but violence too? In 1961, psychologist Albert Bandura conducted an experiment that changed how we understand behavior in children. His goal was to study something known as observational learning, the idea that we don't need to be rewarded or punished to learn something. Sometimes, we just need to watch. The setup was simple. Children were placed in a room where they observed an adult interacting with a toy, a large inflatable clown called a Bobo doll. In some sessions, the adult acted calmly. In others, the adult hit the doll with a hammer, kicked it, shouted at it, and threw it across the room. After watching the adult, the child was taken into a similar room, filled with toys, including the same Bobo doll. What happened next was quietly horrifying. The children who had seen the aggressive adult began to mimic the behavior. They didn't just hit the doll. They used the same actions, the same weapons, the same words. Some even improvised new forms of violence, more extreme than what they'd seen. Children who hadn't witnessed aggression didn't act out. Bandura's experiment proved something critical. Children learn behaviors by watching others, especially adults, and they imitate not just actions, but attitudes, emotion, intent. The most unsettling part wasn't the violence itself. It was how effortless it was to transfer. There were no rewards, no punishments, just an example, and a child willing to follow it. The implications were massive. The Bobo doll experiment sparked decades of research into media violence, parenting, and social learning. It raised uncomfortable questions about what children absorb from TV, games, schools, and their own families. Because if aggression can be learned through observation, so can cruelty, so can prejudice, so can fear. The mind of a child isn't a blank slate. It's a mirror. Robbers Cave Experiment, 1954. Creating and fixing hostility between groups. What does it take to turn strangers into enemies and then back into allies? In the summer of 1954, psychologist Muzaffar Sharif ran an experiment at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. 22 11-year-old boys, all white, middle class, and similar in background, were invited to a summer camp. But this wasn't a vacation. It was a staged conflict. At first, the boys were split into two groups, unaware of each other's existence. They bonded within their groups, forming names, flags, songs, and identities, the Rattlers and the Eagles. Then came the meeting. The two groups were introduced through competitive games, tug-of-war, baseball, capture the flag. The competitions were designed to create friction, and it worked. Quickly, the groups developed hostilities, name-calling, theft, vandalism, even physical fights. The boys weren't evil. They were simply acting out group identity under pressure. In just days, they had gone from strangers to rivals. But the second phase was even more revealing. Sharif introduced shared challenges, tasks that neither group could complete alone. Fixing the camp's water supply, pushing a stalled truck, coordinating a movie night. Gradually, the boys began to cooperate. They talked, helped each other, ate together. The conflict began to dissolve. The Robbers' Cave experiment demonstrated realistic conflict theory. The idea that group conflict arises from competition over limited resources, but can be resolved through shared goals. But beneath that was a darker insight. That division is easy to manufacture. A group name, a bit of rivalry, and a false sense of threat, and children became hostile. It showed how humans, even at a young age, can be manipulated into us versus them thinking, and how quickly loyalty can be turned against another. The experiment wasn't just about boys in a forest. It was a microcosm of tribalism, and it revealed how society's fractures can be seeded and maybe, just maybe, repaired. The Pit of Despair, 1970s. Collapsing the mind through isolation. How long does it take to break a mind with loneliness? In the 1970s, psychologist Harry Harlow, known for his controversial studies on love and attachment in monkeys, created a device he called the Pit of Despair. Even the name was brutal. The device was a small, vertical chamber made of metal, with slippery walls and no windows. Young rhesus monkeys, often just a few months old, were placed inside for extended periods alone. No light, no contact, no comfort. They were left in isolation for weeks. The results were devastating. At first, the monkeys screamed. They reached for something, anything. Then they became quiet. They slumped. Some stopped eating. Some clutched themselves and rocked for hours. A few refused to move at all. Even after they were released, the psychological damage remained. Many of them never reintegrated socially. Some became catatonic. Others showed signs of psychosis. A few hurt themselves. Harlow wasn't trying to be cruel for the sake of it. His goal was to study depression, to create a model that mimicked human emotional collapse. But the ethics of his methods were widely condemned. The experiment exposed a chilling truth. Isolation doesn't just cause sadness, it corrodes the very structure of the mind. Loneliness, when prolonged and absolute, becomes more than discomfort. It becomes a form of psychological death. The brain, wired for contact and interaction, begins to fold inward. What Harlow's Pit of Despair showed, harshly and undeniably, was that social creatures do not survive an emotional vacuum. We need others, and without them, we fall apart. Reimer twins case, 1965 to 2004. A gender identity experiment gone wrong. What happens when you try to erase someone's identity before she can even speak? In 1965, twin boys were born in Canada, Bruce and Brian Reimer. At 8 months old, Bruce suffered a medical accident during a botched circumcision. His penis was severely damaged. His parents, desperate and devastated, turned to a psychologist named Dr. John Money, who proposed a radical solution: raise Bruce as a girl. Money believed that gender identity was entirely shaped by upbringing, not biology. He convinced the Reimers to rename Bruce as Brenda, dress her as a girl, and raise her as female. From the outside, it seemed like a test of a theory. But for Brenda, it was life. From early on, Brenda resisted the identity. She tore off dresses, refused toys labeled for girls, and fought against the roles assigned to her. She was confused, angry, and socially withdrawn. But Dr. Money insisted the experiment was a success. publishing case studies that supported his theory of gender neutrality. What the papers didn't mention was that Brenda was suffering. She endured forced therapy sessions, invasive questioning, and psychological distress. Her twin, Brian, was also drawn into these sessions, which have since been described as abusive. By age 14, Brenda refused to continue living as a girl. She transitioned back to male, renamed herself David, and began hormone therapy. But the damage had already been done. Years later, David's story became public. The so-called John/Joan case, once hailed as a success, was exposed as a catastrophic failure. David suffered from depression. His brother Brian died by overdose. In 2004, David took his own life. This wasn't an experiment with charts and graphs. It was a childhood rewritten by theory, and a life lost to the belief that identity could be engineered. The Reimer case shook the foundation of gender psychology. It revealed that identity isn't just skin deep, it's felt, known, lived, and when it's denied, the consequences can be fatal. Her name was Brenda, but she was never allowed to be herself. And when she finally was, it was already too late. The Stanford nursery study, 1970s, giving labels to toddlers. Can a single word shape how a child is treated for the rest of her life? In the 1970s, researchers at Stanford University conducted a subtle but revealing experiment in a preschool setting. Their question was deceptively simple. What happens when we give labels to children, especially labels about behavior? Teachers were told certain toddlers had been identified through testing as bloomers, children who were expected to develop rapidly, show strong intelligence, and stand out over the year. But there was a twist. The children had been randomly selected. No real tests were conducted. The label was fake. Yet over time, something began to change. The bloomers began receiving more attention from teachers, more encouragement, more eye contact, more warmth, and the children responded. They performed better. They seemed more confident, more vocal. Their self-image grew stronger. The other children, not neglected, but less seen, less engaged, less praised, and over time, they began to mirror those expectations too. This phenomenon became known as the Pygmalion Effect, a self-fulfilling prophecy where higher expectations lead to better performance, simply because the expectation exists. But for every child labeled a bloomer, there's another silently labeled average, or difficult, or quiet, and that, too, shapes behavior. For a little girl told she's not as bright, or not as focused, or not the type, the label becomes a lens through which others see her, and through which she eventually sees herself. This study showed how fragile and powerful the early years are, how quickly praise or neglect can crystallize into identity. It wasn't about discipline or punishment. It was about perception, and how easily perception becomes destiny. The scary part? None of the children knew they were part of an experiment. They were simply living under someone else's story. The Human Zoo, 1969. Urban life as a cage for the mind. What if modern civilization is a psychological trap? In 1969, zoologist and ethologist Desmond Morris published a controversial idea that humans living in cities are not just surviving in artificial environments, they're being psychologically caged by them. He called it the Human Zoo. The idea wasn't tested in a lab. It came from decades of observing both animals and humans, and noting the disturbing parallels between creatures in captivity and people in dense urban societies. Morris argued that in nature, animals have territory, purpose, movement, and hierarchy. In a zoo, those patterns are disrupted. Caged animals develop unusual behaviors, pacing, self-harm, aggression, sexual dysfunction. They become detached from their instincts. In humans, he believed we show similar symptoms. In cities, people are packed into tight spaces. Surveillance is constant. Competition is high. Status symbols replace survival instincts. Instead of hunting food, we hunt validation. Instead of territorial defense, we scroll, swipe, and posture. We become anxious, depressed, overstimulated. We develop rituals, addictions, obsessions, not unlike animals circling in cages. Morris wasn't condemning civilization. He was warning about its effects. He believed modern environments could disconnect people from the psychological structures we evolved with: nature, tribe, space, rhythm. And just like animals in a zoo, we might look safe, but not be well. Women, too, have been deeply affected by this social confinement, boxed into roles, routines, and pressures that offer no room for breath. Her days may be full, but her instincts may be starving. The human zoo wasn't about city planning. It was about the silent erosion of the psyche in a world of artificial systems. And it asked a haunting question: if this is a zoo, who's the keeper? Strange Situation Test, 1970s. Measuring infant attachment through abandonment. How do you know if a child trusts you until you leave the room? In the 1970s, developmental psychologist Mary Ainsworth designed an experiment to explore the nature of attachment between infants and their caregivers. She called it the Strange Situation Test, and it remains one of the most cited studies in developmental psychology. The setup was controlled but emotionally charged. A mother and her infant, usually between 12 to 18 months old, would enter a room filled with toys. The child was encouraged to explore, while the mother sat nearby. Then, a stranger entered the room, and then, quietly, the mother left. The baby was observed for signs of distress, confusion, and how she reacted to the presence of the unfamiliar adult. A few minutes later, the mother returned. The child's response to this reunion was the heart of the study. Some children cried when their mother left, but were easily soothed when she returned. Others showed intense distress and couldn't be comforted. Some barely reacted at all, neither during her absence, nor when she came back. From these patterns, Ainsworth identified 3 major attachment styles: secure, anxious resistant, and avoidant. But what the test revealed wasn't just behavior. It uncovered the emotional blueprint children were building about the world, about safety, trust, and whether comfort could be counted on. A securely attached child believed, "When I'm scared, she will come back." An avoidant child learned, "My needs don't matter." An anxious child feared, "She might return, but I can't be sure." These beliefs don't vanish with childhood. They echo into adult relationships, shaping how we seek love, how we fear rejection, and how we cope with loss. The Strange Situation was only a few minutes long, but in that short span, it opened a window into how early emotional bonds define our lives. And for the little girl who wasn't sure if her mother would return, that uncertainty might follow her for years. Rapp Park, 1978. Addiction in a Cage versus Addiction in a Community. Is addiction about chemistry or loneliness? In the late 1970s, psychologist Bruce K. Alexander challenged one of the dominant beliefs in addiction science, that drug dependency is purely about the substance. He believed that environment mattered just as much, maybe more. To test this, he created 2 settings for rats. The first was a traditional lab cage, small, isolated, empty. A rat in this cage was given 2 water bottles, one with plain water, the other laced with morphine. As expected, the rats in solitary conditions drank heavily from the drugged water, many to the point of overdose. Then came Rat Park. It was spacious, filled with toys, tunnels, and other rats, both male and female, a kind of rodent utopia. In this enriched, social environment, the same 2 water bottles were provided. But this time, something changed. The rats in Rat Park largely ignored the morphine water. They preferred plain water. Even when given the drug, they didn't consume it compulsively. They played, mated, and explored. Addiction didn't vanish, but it lost its grip. Alexander's conclusion was profound. It wasn't just the drug, it was the cage. When rats were isolated, bored, and alone, They turned to escape. But when given stimulation, community, and meaning, the urge to self-medicate weakened. And if that's true for rats, what does it mean for humans? For the woman numbing her pain with pills? For the teen spiraling in loneliness? For the man who drinks to feel something? Maybe the answer isn't just detox, but connection. Rat Park wasn't just about lab design. It was about the psychology of despair. And it raised a radical question. What if addiction is not a disease in the individual, but a symptom of the cage we've built around her? Project MKUltra, 1953 to 1973. Government experiments in mind control. What if your thoughts were never truly yours? Between the 1950s and early 1970s, the CIA conducted a series of highly secretive and deeply unethical psychological experiments under the codename MKUltra. The goal, to explore mind control by any means necessary. The program involved more than 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, and prisons. Subjects were often unaware. Consent was rarely obtained, and the methods used were harrowing. People were dosed with LSD without warning. Others were kept awake for days, isolated in dark rooms. Some were subjected to electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, or hypnosis. A few were given high doses of drugs and then interrogated while restrained. The idea was to find ways to extract truth, erase memories, or implant new ones. The CIA hoped to create techniques for controlling behavior, perhaps even building a Manchurian candidate who could be programmed to kill on command. Women, too, were used as unwitting subjects, sometimes lured into experiments through fake therapy or coerced by authority figures. Their reactions were studied, their breakdowns measured, their minds became test grounds. But none of it worked as intended. What MKUltra succeeded in wasn't mind control, but psychological destruction. Many participants suffered long-term trauma. Some never fully recovered. At least one died after falling from a building under mysterious circumstances. Others were left with fragmented memories, anxiety, and permanent psychological scars. When the program was exposed in the 1970s, the public was stunned. Official documents were destroyed. Testimonies were buried. And to this day, the full extent of what was done under MKUltra is still unknown. The experiment asked, can the mind be controlled? And the answer, quietly, brutally, was yes. Not through hypnosis or LSD, but through fear, isolation, and betrayal. MKUltra wasn't science fiction. It was science used without ethics. And it left behind not just broken people, but a blueprint of how fragile the mind can be when it's treated like a weapon. David Rosenhan's pseudo-patient study, 1973. Pretending to be insane to expose psychiatry. What if you were sane, but no one believed you? In 1973, psychologist David Rosenhan conducted one of the most unsettling critiques of psychiatry ever designed. He wanted to know, could mental health professionals really distinguish between sanity and mental illness? So, he and 7 others, a mix of professionals and ordinary individuals, faked auditory hallucinations to gain admission to various psychiatric hospitals. They used only one false symptom, that they heard a voice saying empty, hollow, and thud. Everything else about them was entirely normal. Each one was admitted. Once inside, the pseudo-patients stopped faking. They answered all questions truthfully. They reported no more hallucinations. But that didn't matter. None of them were discharged quickly. In fact, they were all diagnosed with serious mental illnesses, primarily schizophrenia, and kept for an average of 19 days. One was hospitalized for almost 2 months. The staff, nurses, and doctors saw every normal behavior through a lens of illness. If a pseudo-patient took notes, it was labeled as writing behavior. If she paced the hallway, it was nervous agitation. Even when they told the staff they were part of a study, they were ignored. Interestingly, other patients often saw through the act. One reportedly said, "You're not crazy. You're a journalist or a professor. But the professionals didn't. The study revealed that once someone is labeled as mentally ill, everything they do is interpreted through that label. Identity becomes diagnosis. Behavior becomes symptom. After the study was published, one hospital challenged Rosenhan, saying their staff would be able to detect any imposters. Rosenhan agreed to send pseudo-patients, but in reality, he sent no one. Yet the hospital flagged over 40 people as likely fakes. They saw illness where there was none. The implications were terrifying. A system meant to heal could not reliably detect who was well. And for those inside, including her, a woman who had never been ill, her mind wasn't questioned, only her file. Blue Eyes/Brown Eyes Experiment, 1968. Teaching prejudice in one afternoon. How long does it take to create discrimination? Hours, not generations. In 1968, the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, elementary school teacher Jane Elliott decided to teach her all-white third-grade class in Iowa a lesson they would never forget. She divided her class by eye color. First, she told the blue-eyed children that they were superior, smarter, cleaner, better behaved. Brown-eyed children were labeled lazy, messy, and less intelligent. They were given fewer privileges. They had to sit at the back. They weren't allowed to drink from the same water fountain. The results were immediate. The blue-eyed children became arrogant, domineering, and cruel. They performed better on tests. They taunted the others. The brown-eyed children became anxious, withdrawn, and discouraged. Their performance dropped. Their confidence collapsed. The next day, Elliot flipped the roles. Now brown eyes were superior. The behaviors reversed instantly. What Elliot revealed was how quickly arbitrary traits can become the basis for real oppression, and how fast children, even kind, innocent ones, absorb roles of superiority and inferiority when authority endorses it. The exercise wasn't done in malice, but its effects were deep. Years later, many students reported that it changed how they saw the world. One girl, now grown, said she never forgot the look in her classmate's eyes when he believed she was lesser. Another said it was the first time she realized what racism could feel like. It wasn't history. It was personal. Elliot's experiment has since been praised and criticized. Some say it was too intense for children. Others argue it was one of the most powerful lessons on empathy ever created. But the message remains chilling. You don't need violence to teach prejudice. You don't need laws. You just need a voice of authority and a reason to divide. And for the little girl with brown eyes, that day was more than an exercise. It was a wound and a mirror. Harlow's surrogate mother experiments, 1950s. The science of comfort over survival. What does a baby crave more, food or love? In the 1950s, psychologist Harry Harlow conducted a series of experiments on infant rhesus monkeys that remain among the most disturbing and revealing in the history of developmental psychology. Harlow was exploring the roots of attachment. At the time, many believed that infants bonded with their mothers primarily for food. To test this, he built two surrogate mothers. One was made of wire and had a bottle attached. The other was covered in soft cloth, but offered no food. Infant monkeys were separated from their biological mothers and placed in cages with both surrogates. What happened next shattered previous assumptions. The babies spent nearly all their time clinging to the cloth mother, running to her when frightened, curling up against her for sleep. They approached the wire mother only to feed, and even then, reluctantly. Harlow found that when the monkeys were scared by loud noises or unfamiliar environments, they didn't run to food. They ran to comfort. He introduced more variables. When raised with only the wire mother, the monkeys grew up socially dysfunctional. Some became withdrawn. Others were violent. Many could not mate or care for their own offspring. The deprivation of nurturing contact left them emotionally hollow. These were not just behavioral effects. They were psychological fractures. Harlow's work showed that love, warmth, and physical touch were not luxuries. They were fundamental to healthy development. Without them, the mind withers. One female monkey raised in isolation was later observed rocking endlessly in her cage, even when surrounded by others. Her body was alive, but her emotional world had stopped growing long ago. Harlow's findings changed how hospitals, orphanages, and caregivers approached infant care. But they also raised ethical questions about the suffering inflicted and whether the insights were worth the cost. The experiments proved that the need for comfort isn't secondary. For her, the infant curled against cloth, reaching out into empty space. Love was survival. Seligman's Learned Helplessness, 1967. Training the mind to give up. What happens when the mind learns that escape is impossible? In 1967, psychologist Martin Seligman conducted an experiment on dogs that would uncover something quietly devastating about human behavior, something he later called learned helplessness. The experiment began with a harness. Dogs were placed into a situation where they were exposed to electric shocks, random, inescapable, and uncontrollable. They couldn't predict when the shocks would come, and there was no action they could take to stop them. Then, Seligman placed the dogs in a new setup, a shuttle box divided into two sides by a low barrier. When the shock was applied, the dog could escape it by simply jumping over the barrier. But many didn't. They whimpered. They lay down. They didn't even try. Why? Because they had learned, from the first part of the experiment, that nothing they did mattered, even though freedom was now within reach. Their minds had accepted defeat. This wasn't about pain tolerance. It was about hope, or the lack of it. The concept of learned helplessness soon found relevance far beyond dogs. Psychologists began to see the same behavior in people. Those facing chronic stress, abuse, systemic failure, or emotional neglect. When someone is repeatedly punished, ignored, or silenced, especially early in life, she may stop trying. Not because she lacks strength, but because her mind has learned that her strength doesn't matter. Seligman's dogs taught us that hopelessness isn't born, it's conditioned. And the cage is often psychological. Gazzaniga's split brain experiments, 1960s. A mind divided against itself. What if your left hand didn't know what your right was doing? In the 1960s, neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga worked with patients who had undergone corpus callosotomy, a surgery in which the bundle of nerves connecting the brain's two hemispheres is severed to treat severe epilepsy. These individuals were otherwise normal. But what Gazzaniga discovered after the surgery revealed something deeply strange about how the mind works. He found that the left and right sides of the brain, once separated, no longer shared information in the usual way. He conducted tests in which one hemisphere received visual input, like a word or image, that the other couldn't access. The results were surreal. When the right hemisphere, which controls the left hand, saw an object like a key, the person could reach for it with her left hand. But if asked to name it, she couldn't. The left hemisphere, which handles language, hadn't seen it. In some cases, one hand would button a shirt while the other unbuttoned it, or one hand would reach for something, while the other slapped it away. The brain had effectively split into two consciousnesses, each aware of the world, but no longer fully communicating. But perhaps the most unsettling finding was the brain's need to explain. When the left hemisphere didn't understand what the right was doing, it invented a reason, even if it was completely false. Gazzaniga called this the interpreter function. The brain doesn't just process truth. It builds a story, even when that story is wrong. For her, the patient confused by her own hands. The body was no longer a unified whole, and the self was not singular. Facial feedback hypothesis, 1988. Smiling without feeling it. Can a fake smile change the way you actually feel? In 1988, psychologists Fritz Strack, Leonard Martin, and Sabine Stepper conducted an experiment that seemed almost silly until the results revealed something profound. Participants were asked to hold a pen in their mouths in one of two ways. Some held it with their teeth, forcing their facial muscles into a smile. Others held it with their lips, preventing a smile. Then, they were shown cartoons. The group who had been smiling, involuntarily, without realizing, rated the cartoons as significantly funnier. Their mood had lifted, all because their face was smiling. This became known as the facial feedback hypothesis, the idea that facial expressions don't just reflect emotion, they help create it. The body doesn't just react to the mind. It can influence the mind. Later replications have had mixed results. But the core idea persists. Expression affects emotion. And the implications are stranger than they seem. If smiling can increase happiness, even when faked, what happens when a person frowns constantly? Or when her face is frozen in grief? Or blank from trauma? What if the shape of the face becomes the tone of the mind? In therapy, posture, breathing, and expression are now used to gently shift emotional states. Trauma specialists often work with the body first, not the thoughts, because emotion lives in muscle, breath, and skin. For her, the woman told to just smile more. The science doesn't justify the advice, but it does suggest that even when she doesn't feel joy, the body might offer a way to begin remembering it. Not by pretending, but by practicing. Dutton and Aaron's Bridge Study, 1974. When fear feels like attraction. What if your heart's racing, but you mistake it for love? In 1974, psychologists Donald Dutton and Arthur Aaron designed a study to explore how emotional arousal could influence romantic attraction. The setup was unusual. Two bridges were chosen, one high, narrow, and shaky, the kind that made your palms sweat. The other, low and stable. Male participants were approached by an attractive female interviewer midway across either bridge. She asked them to complete a short survey, then handed them her number, saying they could call if they had questions about the study. The difference came after. Men who crossed the shaky, high bridge were far more likely to call her. Not only that, their answers on the survey included more sexual imagery. Why? The researchers proposed a theory. The men's heightened physiological state, rapid heartbeat, adrenaline, tension, was misattributed to the woman. They weren't just afraid. Their brains connected the physical arousal to the presence of her. This became known as misattribution of arousal, the idea that the body's signals can be misunderstood by the mind. And this isn't just about attraction. Fear can be mistaken for excitement. Anxiety can be misread as passion. People in crisis often form intense bonds. Relationships born in chaos sometimes feel more real than those born in calm. The brain doesn't just interpret emotions. Sometimes, it confuses them. For her, the woman who wonders why she keeps chasing intensity over peace. The Bridge Study offers a strange truth. Sometimes what feels like love is just your heart trying to make sense of fear. Racial Bias in Pain Perception, 2014. When doctors don't feel your pain, what if the people meant to help don't believe you're hurting? In 2014, researchers at the University of Virginia conducted a study that exposed a deeply disturbing pattern in medicine. Racial bias in how pain is perceived and treated, even by trained professionals. Participants, including medical students and residents, were asked to evaluate hypothetical cases. In some, the patients were white. In others, they were black. The doctors were also given a list of statements and asked to agree or disagree. Shockingly, some participants endorsed beliefs that are biologically false, such as that black people have thicker skin or less sensitive nerve endings. Even those who didn't believe these myths were still more likely to underestimate black patients' pain and less likely to recommend appropriate treatment. This wasn't about conscious hatred. It was about implicit bias, deeply embedded cultural narratives that shape judgment, often without awareness. The implications were devastating. Studies have shown that black patients are less likely to receive pain medication in hospitals, more likely to have their symptoms dismissed, and less likely to be taken seriously. Women of color, in particular, report being ignored, questioned, or misdiagnosed, even during life-threatening events like childbirth complications. The brain absorbs patterns from the world around it, from media, from language, from history, and when those patterns go unchecked, they become silent distortions. For her, the woman in the ER, holding her side, trying to explain that something feels wrong, being heard can feel like a battle. The pain is real, but the system doesn't always believe it. Hindsight Bias Experiments, 1975 present. I knew it all along. Do we really learn from the past, or do we rewrite it? Since the 1970s, psychologists have studied a quiet distortion of memory called hindsight bias, the tendency to believe, after something has happened, that we knew it all along. In one common version of the experiment, participants are given historical scenarios or real-world events. After reading, they're told the outcome, for example, who won a war, whether a medical treatment succeeded, or if a stock crashed. Then, they're asked how surprising the outcome was, and how likely they would have predicted it. Consistently, participants say the result seemed obvious in retrospect, even if they wouldn't have guessed it beforehand. It's not just false memory. It's the illusion of foresight, wrapped in the comfort of certainty. The danger lies in what this does to learning and empathy. If we believe the outcome was inevitable, we're less likely to understand the complexity of what led there. We blame victims for not seeing it coming. We judge leaders, parents, even ourselves, not based on what was known at the time, but based on what we know now. Hindsight bias gives us the illusion of wisdom and takes away compassion. For her, the woman who stayed too long in a relationship or missed a sign she couldn't have known, the voice inside might say, "How could I be so stupid?" But that voice isn't truth. It's hindsight, posing as clarity. The mind doesn't just remember, it edits. And sometimes, the past we believe is one we quietly invented. False memory implantation, 1995. Making you remember what never happened. Can you be convinced that something terrible happened to you when it didn't? In 1995, psychologist Elizabeth Loftus conducted a study that shook the foundation of memory research. She set out to explore whether people could be made to remember entire events that had never actually happened, not just confused details, but fully fabricated experiences. Participants were given descriptions of 4 childhood events, allegedly gathered from family members. 3 were true. The 4th was a complete invention, something harmless, like getting lost in a shopping mall. They were asked to recall what they could about each event, and over several interviews, they were encouraged to try harder and visualize what had happened. The results were alarming. About 1/3 of participants came to believe the false memory was real. Not only that, they added rich, emotional details. They remembered what the mall smelled like, who comforted them, what stores they saw. They insisted it happened, even when told it had been invented. Loftus's work proved that memory isn't a recording device. It's reconstructive, shaped by suggestion, language, and belief. The mind can create entire emotional narratives out of fragments, especially when they're reinforced by trust and repetition. And this had massive implications. It raised serious concerns about therapy techniques that might unintentionally implant memories, especially in cases of trauma, abuse, or repressed experiences. It cast doubt on certain eyewitness testimonies, and it reminded us that confidence in a memory doesn't mean accuracy. For her, the woman certain that something terrible happened in her childhood, even when no evidence exists, the feeling may be real, but that doesn't make it true. And that's the terrifying part. Sometimes, what we remember never happened at all. The false consensus effect, 1977. Thinking everyone thinks like you. What if you're not surrounded by agreement, just projection? In 1977, researchers Lee Ross, David Green, and Pamela House demonstrated something quietly unsettling about how we view others. We assume that our beliefs, values, and decisions are more common than they actually are. This is known as the false consensus effect. In the original study, participants were given a scenario. Would they agree to walk around campus for 30 minutes wearing a large sandwich board that said, "Eat at Joe's"? Some agreed. Others refused. Then came the crucial question. What percentage of others would do the same? Regardless of their answer, participants overwhelmingly believed most people would make the same choice they did. Those who said yes believed others would too. Those who said no believed others would refuse. This wasn't just about confidence, it was about projection. The mind assumes that its own reasoning is normal, typical, shared. But this illusion is dangerous. It reinforces bias. It isolates people in bubbles of perceived agreement. It makes extreme views feel validated, even when they're fringe. It blinds us to how diverse, and often contradictory, real human thought can be. In relationships, it creates frustration. How could she not see it this way? In politics, it fuels tribalism. Everyone I know agrees, so they must be right. In conflict, it hardens misunderstanding. No one would react like her unless she was overreacting. The false consensus effect isn't loud. It's quiet, internal, a mirror pretending to be a window. And for her, the woman who feels out of place because her thoughts don't align with those around her, maybe she's not the outlier. Maybe she's just not mistaking her voice for the world. The Door Study, 1998. Not noticing a new person right in front of you. How much can change before your mind notices anything's different? In 1998, psychologists Daniel Simons and Daniel Levin conducted a now famous experiment in visual perception, an unsettling demonstration of how much our attention filters reality. The setup was simple. An experimenter would stop a stranger on the street and ask for directions. Midway through the conversation, two people carrying a large wooden door would walk between them, momentarily blocking the view. During that brief moment, the original experimenter was replaced with a different person, often someone of different height, build, even clothing. And the astonishing part? More than half of the participants didn't notice. This phenomenon is called change blindness, the brain's tendency to overlook large changes when its attention is focused elsewhere. It's not about intelligence. It's not even about eyesight. It's about how the mind selectively constructs experience. We like to believe we notice everything. But in reality, awareness is narrow. We track what we believe matters and discard the rest, even when the rest is someone's entire identity changing mid-conversation. The implications are vast. Witnesses can be wrong without lying. Drivers miss motorcyclists. Security guards miss threats. People in crisis go unseen, not because others don't care, but because attention is a fragile beam of light. And in relationships, it can be even more painful. For her, the woman who's changed, who's grown, who's silently struggling, it might feel like no one notices. And maybe they really don't. Not because they don't love her, but because their minds, like all of ours, only see what they expect. Stanford Hypnotic Susceptibility Scale, 1959. Measuring who can be mentally controlled. What if some minds are more open to control than others? In 1959, psychologists Andre Weitzenhofer and Ernest Hilgard developed the Stanford Hypnotic Susceptibility Scale, a test designed to measure how easily a person could be hypnotized. Hypnosis wasn't a magic trick. It was a psychological state, a deep form of focus and suggestion. But not everyone responded the same way. Some people resisted completely. Others followed instructions they didn't even remember. The scale was built on a series of tasks, like imagining your arm getting lighter, or forgetting a number you just said. The more a person complied, the more suggestible they were considered. And the results were quietly unsettling. Roughly 10 to 15% of people are highly hypnotizable, meaning they can enter trance states deeply and quickly. Under guided suggestion, they may experience hallucinations, amnesia, or even false memories, not because they're gullible, but because their brains are wired to absorb influence more directly. This has therapeutic use. Hypnosis has helped people manage pain, break habits, and recover from trauma. But it also revealed how fragile the boundary is between suggestion and belief. Highly susceptible individuals can be made to feel cold in a warm room, to forget their name, or even to see things that aren't there, all through voice, framing, repetition. And it doesn't stop with hypnosis. Advertising, social media, cult recruitment, interrogation, all rely on the same psychological levers. Language, rhythm, repetition, a calm voice, a simple command. For her, the woman who followed instructions without knowing why, who couldn't explain why she said yes when she meant no. The answer may lie in how her mind processed suggestion. She wasn't weak. She was open. And openness can be a doorway. The Visual Cliff, 1960. Teaching babies to fear the drop. Are we born afraid, or do we learn to be? In 1960, psychologists Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk designed an experiment to test depth perception and fear in infants. One that would reveal how early the mind begins to calculate risk. The setup was called the Visual Cliff. A special table was constructed with a thick sheet of glass. On one side, a checkerboard pattern sat directly beneath the glass. On the other, the pattern dropped off several feet, creating the illusion of a sudden cliff. The surface was perfectly safe, but it didn't look that way. Infants were placed on the solid side, and their mothers stood across the cliff, encouraging them to crawl forward. What happened? Most babies, once they reached the visual drop, refused to cross. They hesitated. They cried. Even when her mother called gently from the other side, the baby stayed put, staring at the cliff with wide, frozen eyes. This reaction occurred in infants too young to have ever experienced a fall. The implication, depth perception, and possibly the fear of falling, develops earlier than language, memory, or even walking. But something else was revealed too. When mothers smiled and encouraged, babies were more likely to try crossing. When mothers looked anxious or afraid, the babies stopped, even if the setup was unchanged. The child wasn't just looking at the drop. She was looking at her mother's face. The visual cliff showed how early emotional cues and perception work together. Safety isn't just visual, it's relational. And the fear of falling isn't just about heights. It's about trust. Backmasking and Subliminal Messaging Studies, 1970s, 1980s. Influencing minds below awareness. Can you hear something without ever knowing it entered you? In the 1970s and 80s, researchers began investigating a strange and controversial question. Could the human brain be influenced by subliminal messages, signals presented below the level of conscious awareness? One of the most infamous examples was backmasking, recording hidden words or phrases in audio tracks, often in reverse. Some claim that rock songs contain satanic messages when played backward. The real concern, however, wasn't supernatural. It was psychological. Studies tested whether backward or low-volume messages could influence behavior, like increasing sales, changing moods, or altering attitudes. The results were mixed, but the patterns were haunting. In a well-known experiment, participants were shown quick flashes of words during films, too fast to consciously register. Some were neutral. Others were emotionally charged. Even though viewers reported noticing nothing, their emotions and choices shifted in predictable ways. They felt uneasy, or happy, or more likely to select certain products, without knowing why. The mind doesn't filter everything through logic. Much of what it absorbs happens silently, below awareness. Patterns, tone, repetition, symbols. A single word can bypass the conscious mind and land in the emotional brain, where it lingers, influencing behavior without a trace. And this hasn't gone away. Modern ads, apps, and platforms use visual and auditory priming. Content is designed to activate craving, envy, urgency, not with what you see, but how quickly and subtly it's delivered. For her, the woman scrolling late at night, feeling inadequate but unsure why. The influence may not be visible, but it's there, because the most powerful messages are the ones you never hear. Contagion of Yawning Experiments, 2000s, present. Empathy in a reflex. Why does one person's yawn trigger yours? Yawning seems simple. A reflex, a stretch, a breath. But in the early 2000s, psychologists began investigating a deeper question. Why are yawns so contagious? And why do we catch them even when we're not tired? In a series of experiments, participants were shown images and videos of people yawning. Some were real people. Others were manipulated or emotionless. The results were consistent. The more emotionally expressive and familiar the person was, the more likely the viewer was to yawn in return. This wasn't just mimicry. It was about empathy. Further studies found that children with autism, who often struggle with emotional mirroring, were less likely to catch yawns. The same was true for people high in psychopathy traits. The findings suggested that contagious yawning was tied to the ability to emotionally resonate with others. Even dogs, domesticated to read human cues, yawn more often when their owners do, especially when she looks them in the eye. So what does this mean? It means the brain has silent pathways that simulate the emotional state of others. And sometimes, the simplest reflex, a yawn, is the echo of someone else's fatigue, stress, or boredom, playing out in your body without permission. Yawning is not just a signal that you're tired. It's a signal that you're connected. And for her, the woman in the room who feels alone, who hasn't spoken in hours, who stares at a stranger on a screen and suddenly yawns, it may be the brain's quiet way of saying, you are not as separate as you think. The Crayon Box Study, 2005. The first time a child lies for social acceptance. When does a child learn that truth can be inconvenient? In 2005, researchers designed a simple experiment to observe the roots of deception in early childhood. The goal wasn't to catch a lie, but to see when and why a child tells one. Children were shown a crayon box. They were asked, "What's inside?" The child would usually say, "Crayons." Then, the box was opened to reveal something unexpected, like candles. The child was surprised, sometimes laughing. Then came the crucial question, what will the next child think is in the box? At around age 3, children would answer honestly, candles. But around age 4 or 5, something changed. They began to say, crayons. Why? Because they had begun to grasp something complex, the idea of false belief in others, that other people might not know what they know, that appearances can deceive, that sometimes truth is strategic. This experiment isn't about lying maliciously. It's about social intelligence emerging. The moment a child realizes that the mind is private, that others have beliefs, and those beliefs can be shaped. And this insight, though small, is the root of manipulation, privacy, shame, and secrets. From this point onward, the child enters a new world, one where the truth is negotiable. For her, the little girl who laughs at the candles, then smiles as she says crayons for the next kid. This is the beginning of diplomacy, and sometimes, of silence. The box held candles, but her words held strategy. The Rubber Hand Illusion, 1998. Confusing the body's boundaries. What if you could be convinced that someone else's hand is yours? In 1998, psychologists Matthew Botvinnik and Jonathan Cohen developed a strange but elegant experiment to explore how the brain constructs a sense of body ownership. Participants sat with one hand hidden behind a screen. In front of them was a rubber hand, positioned to mimic the real one. Both the real and fake hand were stroked gently and simultaneously with a brush. Within minutes, something strange happened. The participant began to feel the rubber hand as her own. She flinched when it was threatened. She described tingling. Some reported temperature changes or pain when the fake hand was harmed, even though it wasn't connected to their body at all. The brain had accepted a false limb. This illusion showed that our sense of physical self is surprisingly flexible and built not just from internal signals, but from what we see and feel in sync. When vision and touch align, the mind can be tricked into rewriting the body map. The implications stretch far. Virtual reality uses this effect to deepen immersion. Neurological rehab uses it to treat phantom limb pain. But it also reveals how easily the brain can be deceived about its own boundaries, how fragile the sense of me really is. And if a rubber hand can become part of the self, what else do we mistake as ours? For her, the woman who saw her own reflection distorted in mirrors, in memories, in shame, the illusion might feel familiar. The body is not always a fixed truth. Sometimes, it's just a story the brain is telling itself. Cheating and the Mirror Study, 1976. What happens when you're watched by yourself? What stops you from cheating when no one else is watching? In 1976, psychologists Diener and Walbaum set out to study what influences honesty, especially when no punishment is involved. Their experiment was clever, subtle, and quietly unnerving. College students were asked to take a timed test alone in a room. They were told not to continue writing once a bell rang. What the students didn't know was that the researchers were watching to see who would cheat, who would keep writing after the timer ended. But here's where the twist came in. For one group of students, there was a mirror placed in front of them. For the others, no mirror at all. The results were clear. Students with the mirror were significantly less likely to cheat. Just the sight of their own reflection made them pause. Why? Because the mirror created something powerful, self-awareness. In seeing herself, a student couldn't hide from her own values, even if no one else was watching. The mirror wasn't a punishment. It was a reminder of identity. This became one of the foundational studies in self-awareness theory. The idea that when people are made more aware of themselves, they are more likely to align with their internal standards and moral codes. But it also hints at something darker. Without self-awareness, when we're disconnected from who we are or why we act, the mind is freer to justify shortcuts, lies, or even cruelty. It's easier to become someone else in the absence of reflection, literally and psychologically. In modern life, the mirror can be public accountability, social reputation, or an inner voice. But when those fade, when she feels unseen, unheard, or detached, something inside begins to shift. The mirror in the room wasn't magic. It was a moment of seeing and being seen. And sometimes, that's enough to hold us together. Priming and the Elderly Walk Study, 1996. Behavior shaped before you know it. Can your body be manipulated just by the words you hear? In 1996, psychologists John Bargh and colleagues conducted an experiment that revealed something deeply strange about the human mind: the concept of priming. The idea that subtle cues can unconsciously influence behavior. Participants were given scrambled sentences to complete. Some of the word sets contained neutral terms. Others were filled with words associated with old age. Things like Florida, retired, bald, wrinkle, gray. Once the task was finished, participants were told they were done. Nothing else was observed. Except it was. What the researchers really measured was how long it took the participants to walk down the hallway after completing the test. And the ones exposed to elderly-related words, they walked significantly slower. They had been primed. Their behavior changed. Not consciously, not dramatically, but measurably. They didn't feel older. They didn't think differently, but their bodies moved with less urgency, as if mirroring a stereotype they didn't even notice. This study opened the door to decades of research on automatic social behavior, showing that we're constantly absorbing cues from language, environment, and even tone. And often, those cues shape us without our permission. Think of product placement, political language, social media. Her day may begin with words she scrolls past: fragile, messy, too much, and by noon, her posture has shifted. She might not remember the sentence, but her legs slow down. Priming is quiet. It doesn't scream. It doesn't tell. It nudges. And that's what makes it so powerful. Choice blindness, 2005. Not realizing you didn't choose what you chose. What if you were handed the wrong choice and accepted it as your own? In 2005, psychologists Peter Johansson and Lars Hall conducted an experiment that revealed a crack in how we understand decision-making, a phenomenon they called choice blindness. Participants were shown 2 photographs of faces and asked to choose which one they found more attractive. After selecting, the researcher handed them the chosen card and asked why they had picked it. But in some cases, using sleight of hand, the researcher secretly switched the photo, giving the participant the image they didn't pick. The shocking part, most participants didn't notice. Even more unsettling, they then proceeded to justify their choice, confidently explaining why they preferred the photo they hadn't actually selected. This happened in over 75% of switched trials. It wasn't just a moment of confusion. It was a construction of preference after the fact. The brain had filled in the logic, invented the reason, and believed it. Choice blindness has since been replicated in consumer products. Moral questions, even political opinions. People often don't detect that their stated beliefs have been reversed, and then defend the reversal. The mind doesn't just remember choices. It builds them, and it wants coherence. If something feels familiar, it becomes acceptable. If something is placed in your hand, or your feed, you may start to believe you wanted it all along. For her, the woman who wonders if this life was ever really her plan, the uncertainty might not be confusion. It might be the brain, smoothing out contradictions, not to deceive, but to protect. Fear conditioning in infants, 1920. The baby who learned to fear a white rat. Can fear be taught? To someone who doesn't even understand the word? In 1920, psychologists John B. Watson and Rosalie Reimer conducted one of the most ethically controversial studies in psychological history. The subject was a 9-month-old baby, known only as Little Albert. The question was simple, yet chilling. Could an infant be trained to fear something he had no reason to fear? Albert was first shown a series of animals, a white rat, a rabbit, a monkey. He showed no fear. He reached for them with curiosity. But then, during one of the rat sessions, the researchers introduced something new, a loud, sharp clang behind his head whenever the rat appeared. Albert flinched. He cried. The sound startled him deeply. Over time, he began to associate the sound with the rat. Soon, the rat alone made him cry. Then the rabbit. Then a dog. Even a white mask. The fear had generalized. In just a few sessions, the infant had learned to fear what he once enjoyed, not because of pain, but because of association. This study became a landmark in classical conditioning, the idea that emotional responses can be trained through experience. But the experiment didn't end with comfort. Albert's fear was never reversed. He was never desensitized. He simply disappeared from the record, and no one is certain what became of him. The ethical violations are now glaring. No consent, no reversal. Emotional trauma inflicted on a child who couldn't speak, couldn't reason, couldn't defend himself. But the lesson lingers. Fear is not always born of danger. Sometimes, it's learned quietly through sound, environment, repetition, a slammed door, a voice raised in anger, the smell of a place tied to loss. And for her, the woman who fears harmless things without knowing why, perhaps the origin lies in a moment long forgotten. Because the mind remembers what the mouth cannot say. The Monster Study, 1939. Tearing down children with words. Can you damage a child just by how you speak to her? In 1939, at the University of Iowa, a speech pathologist named Wendell Johnson and his student Mary Tudor conducted an experiment on orphans that later came to be known, fittingly, as the Monster Study. The researchers wanted to understand how positive and negative reinforcement affected children's speech, particularly stuttering. 22 children living in an orphanage were divided into groups. Some had normal speech. Others already stuttered. Half the children received positive speech therapy. They were praised for clear speech, encouraged, reassured. The other half, including children who didn't stutter, were treated very differently. They were told their speech was wrong, that they were developing problems, that they needed to correct themselves or face consequences. They were interrupted, scolded, told to be ashamed. None of these children had ever shown signs of speech issues before. But by the end of the study, many of them developed anxiety around speaking. Some grew withdrawn. Some became hesitant. Their fluency decreased. And the psychological scars lasted, in some cases, for life. The children were never told they were part of an experiment. No one asked for consent. The researchers believed they were testing a hypothesis. But what they were really doing was teaching shame. This wasn't about speech. It was about how identity can be damaged through repetition. Words don't need to be loud to be destructive. Whispered doubt is enough. A single phrase, "You always mess up," or "You're not good enough," can root itself deep inside a young mind. And for her, the girl who grew up dreading questions in class, who avoids speaking in meetings, whose voice shakes even when she's right, the echo may still be ringing. The words weren't hers, but now she lives as if they are. Illusory Superiority, 1980s present. The myth that you're better than average. Why do so many people believe they're better than most? In the 1980s and beyond, psychologists began to uncover a deeply ironic flaw in human thinking. The tendency for most people to rate themselves above average on traits like intelligence, kindness, driving ability, and ethics. This is called illusory superiority, a type of cognitive bias where the majority believes they're part of the top minority. It's mathematically impossible, of course, but the belief persists. In one study, 93% of American drivers rated themselves as above average. Other studies found similar results in academics, morality, and even honesty. Why does this happen? Because the mind craves identity reinforcement. We don't see ourselves objectively. We see ourselves through selective memory, emotional filtering, and comparison to convenient examples. When someone else messes up, it's because they're flawed. When we do, it's an exception. This illusion offers comfort, a sense of self-worth, agency, confidence, but it also blinds us. It makes feedback feel like an attack. It creates judgment, resentment, and overconfidence. It isolates people who see their own flaws, because when everyone else claims perfection, shame grows in silence, and it leads to dangerous assumptions. A leader who believes she's always right won't listen. A partner who believes he's more thoughtful may ignore your needs. A society that believes it's more just than it is stops improving. For her, the woman who quietly doubts herself in a room full of certainty, this illusion is not her flaw. It may be her clarity, because seeing your own limits isn't weakness. It's rare. The Spotlight Effect, 1999. Overestimating how much people notice you. What if no one is watching as closely as you think? In 1999, psychologists Thomas Gilovich, Victoria Medvec, and Kenneth Savitsky designed an experiment to test a common illusion, the feeling that other people are paying more attention to us than they actually are. They called it the Spotlight Effect. Participants were asked to wear an embarrassing t-shirt, often featuring something cringeworthy or awkward, and walk into a room full of strangers. Afterward, they were asked how many people they thought had noticed their shirt. Then the researchers asked the actual observers. Consistently, participants overestimated how many people had noticed them. Dramatically, the implication, while we often feel like we're under a spotlight, most people are far too absorbed in their own lives to notice our awkwardness, mistakes, or appearances. This illusion isn't about vanity. It's about self-awareness spilling over. The tendency to believe that what feels intense internally must be just as visible externally. But it's not. When she fumbled her words, when she wore the wrong shoes, when she cried in the elevator, she imagined the world watching. In truth, most weren't even looking. The spotlight effect can lead to anxiety, self-censorship, avoidance, but understanding it is freeing. Realizing that most people are not focused on you is not a curse, it's a quiet relief. Because invisibility isn't always loneliness. Sometimes it's protection. Misleading post-event information, 1974. The way you ask changes what you remember. How much of your memory belongs to someone else's words? In 1974, psychologists Elizabeth Loftus and John Palmer conducted an experiment that would forever change how we understand eyewitness memory and how easily it can be manipulated. Participants watched a short video of a car crash. Later, they were asked to estimate the speed of the cars, but with slightly different wording. Some were asked how fast the cars were going when they hit each other. Others heard words like smashed, collided, bumped, or contacted. The results changed with the language. Participants who heard smashed reported higher speeds and were more likely to say they saw broken glass, even though there was none. This phenomenon became known as the misinformation effect, the idea that memories can be altered after the fact simply by the way questions are framed. Memory isn't fixed. It's malleable, vulnerable, influenced by suggestion, tone, even the assumptions baked into the way something is asked. The consequences are serious. Eyewitness testimonies have sent innocent people to prison. Childhood memories have been reshaped in therapy. Political beliefs are reinforced by headlines that distort, not facts themselves. And for her, the woman who remembers a moment differently than her brother, or her partner, or the camera, the conflict isn't necessarily about truth or lies. It's about how memory bends under pressure. Because sometimes, what you remember is just the version you were given. Moral Credential Effect, 2001. When doing good gives you permission to do bad, can being good make you worse? In 2001, researchers Benoit Monin and Dale Miller explored a psychological twist in moral behavior, something they called the Moral Credential Effect. Participants were first asked to express strong support for diversity, such as agreeing with hiring a qualified black candidate for a job. Later, they were asked to make decisions involving ambiguous, possibly biased scenarios. Here's where it got strange. Those who had previously affirmed their moral beliefs were more likely to make biased decisions afterward, like rejecting another minority candidate or showing favoritism to someone more like themselves. Why? Because expressing support gave them psychological permission. They had earned moral credits, and now felt insulated from guilt. Their self-image as a good person allowed them to let their guard down, even when their next action was in conflict with their values. This phenomenon isn't limited to race or hiring. It shows up when someone donates to charity, then cheats on taxes, or when a person defends women's rights, then interrupts her mid-sentence, or when a leader praises fairness, then cuts corners behind closed doors. The moral credential effect isn't hypocrisy. It's mental accounting, the idea that one good deed cancels out the need for consistency. And for her, the woman told she must forgive because others have apologized, or tolerate mistreatment because someone once defended her. The message can feel suffocating, because moral words aren't always followed by moral actions. And conscience, if left unexamined, can become its own excuse. Cognitive Dissonance and the Boring Task Study, 1959. Convincing yourself it was worth it. What if you could lie, and then believe it? In 1959, psychologists Leon Festinger and James Carlsmith set out to explore a peculiar idea, that the mind doesn't just react to truth, it also tries to reduce discomfort when actions and beliefs collide. This became the foundation of cognitive dissonance theory. Participants were asked to complete an incredibly dull, repetitive task, turning pegs on a board for an hour. Then, they were asked to tell the next participant, a planted actor, that the task had been fun and exciting. Some were paid $1 to lie. Others were paid $20. Here's where it gets strange. Those paid only $1 later reported that they actually enjoyed the task more than those who were paid $20. Why? Because $1 wasn't enough to justify lying. So their minds reshaped their memory of the task to reduce the internal conflict. If I said it was fun, maybe it was. The brain reasoned. The participants unconsciously altered their beliefs to match their behavior. This showed that when people experience psychological discomfort between actions and beliefs, the brain will rewrite the narrative, not to deceive, but to protect coherence. And this happens everywhere. When she stays in a relationship that drains her and tells herself it's still worth it. When someone works a job they hate, but insists it's their passion. When a decision can't be undone. The mind rewrites the story to make it make sense. Cognitive dissonance is not a flaw. It's a survival tool. But it can also trap her in illusions she doesn't even know she's built. Because the brain would rather believe a lie than sit with contradiction. Behavioral Sink, 1962 to 1972. When overcrowding destroys society. What happens when a world becomes too full? Between 1962 and 1972, ethologist John B. Calhoun created a series of experiments on population density and social collapse, experiments that became a dark mirror for human behavior. He called them mouse universes. In one of the most infamous studies, Calhoun built a mouse utopia, unlimited food, water, and shelter. No predators, no disease, just a perfect space, called Universe 25, for a few pairs of mice to live and reproduce. And reproduce they did. At first, the population grew rapidly. But then, as the environment became overcrowded, things began to unravel, not from resource scarcity, but from social breakdown. Mice stopped nesting. Mothers abandoned or killed their young. Males grew passive or hyperaggressive. Social roles collapsed. Some mice became withdrawn, grooming excessively. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones. Eventually, the population declined to extinction. The mice had everything they needed, except meaningful structure. Calhoun called it the behavioral sink, a tipping point where social stress, overstimulation, and isolation within crowding led to irreversible dysfunction. Though the experiment involved mice, the implications for human societies were clear and disturbing. Urban density, overstimulation, and breakdown of social bonds could mirror the same patterns. And in today's world of digital noise, vanishing connection, and crowded mental space, the behavioral sink may not be physical. It may be psychological. For her, the woman surrounded by people but feeling unseen, overstimulated yet empty, the collapse may not be loud. It may arrive slowly, in a beautiful room where no one remembers how to care. The halo effect, 1920 present. When one good trait masks the rest. What if beauty makes you believe in kindness? The halo effect is one of the oldest and most quietly dangerous biases studied in psychology. First coined by psychologist Edward Thorndike in 1920. It refers to the way one positive trait, usually attractiveness, spills over, shaping how we perceive everything else about a person. Thorndike first observed this in military officers, where those rated as physically attractive were also assumed to be more intelligent, moral, and competent, even without evidence. Later studies confirmed this bias across professions, schools, courts, and dating. A teacher might grade an attractive student more favorably. A jury may trust a handsome defendant. A leader with charm may be forgiven far more than one without. The brain likes shortcuts, and beauty, or charisma, becomes a mental shortcut for virtue. But the danger is subtle. The halo effect leads us to trust the wrong people, to overlook red flags, to follow the confident instead of the qualified. It allows manipulation, favoritism, even abuse, because the first impression masks the reality beneath. And it works in reverse. 2. A woman who is shy might be misread as cold. A man with a scar might be assumed to be less trustworthy. The mind fills in the blanks with its biases. For her, the woman who is overlooked, judged too quickly, or praised for surface traits that don't reflect who she truly is. The halo isn't protection. It's distortion. Because when perception becomes the truth, truth disappears. Tragedy of the Commons in Group Experiments, 1968, present. When everyone consumes, everyone loses. What if your personal gain leads to collective collapse? In 1968, ecologist Garrett Hardin described a principle that would echo through environmental psychology, economics, and social behavior: the tragedy of the commons. The idea was simple. In a shared resource system, like a public pasture, individuals acting in their own interest can end up destroying the very thing everyone depends on. But this wasn't just a theory. Behavioral experiments soon followed. Groups were asked to share limited resources: fish from a digital pond, tokens from a pot, time from a communal clock. They were told if they took only a little, the resource would last. If they took too much, it would shrink and then disappear. Despite knowing the risk, many took more than their share. Why? Because they believed someone else would, or that their individual impact was too small to matter. Self-interest, even when rationalized, gradually led to depletion. The group lost everything, not because of evil, but because of accumulated choices. This tragedy plays out in traffic, climate, digital attention, and even relationships. When everyone scrolls without limit, real connection dies. When everyone interrupts, no one is heard. When everyone takes, even a little, the silence that follows feels earned. For her, the woman who gives more than she takes, who sees the common good as something worth protecting. The pain comes from watching others drain the well. Not all at once, but one scoop at a time. Just World Hypothesis Experiments, 1960s, present. Believing victims deserve their pain. Why do we blame people for what was done to them? In the 1960s, psychologist Melvin Lerner conducted a series of experiments to study how people respond to the suffering of others, especially when that suffering seems unfair. Participants were shown a woman receiving painful electric shocks for a learning task. Some were told she volunteered. Others weren't. Some were told she'd be compensated. Others saw her continue with no benefit. What Lerner found was deeply unsettling. The more helpless the woman appeared, the more unjust the situation, the more likely participants were to blame her. They said she must have done something wrong, that she was exaggerating, that maybe she deserved it. Why? Because people needed to preserve their belief in a just world, the comforting illusion that good things happen to good people, and bad things happen for a reason. When faced with evidence to the contrary, the mind defends itself by shifting blame, not because it's cruel, but because it's scared. If innocent people suffer, then anyone can suffer, including her. The just world hypothesis helps explain victim blaming in sexual assault, poverty, illness, or war. It's not always malicious. Sometimes, it's just a terrified brain trying to keep the world simple. For her, the woman who was told it must have been her fault, who was asked what she was wearing, or why she stayed, this wasn't judgment. It was denial disguised as logic. Because admitting she was innocent means accepting no one is safe. The Backfire Effect, 2006. When facts make beliefs stronger. What if evidence doesn't change minds? It reinforces them. In 2006, political scientists Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler explored something quietly horrifying: how people react when presented with facts that contradict their beliefs. Participants were shown news articles that contained misinformation, for example, false claims about weapons of mass destruction. Then, they were shown corrected versions with factual evidence. Instead of changing their minds, many doubled down on the false belief. This became known as the Backfire Effect, when corrections not only fail to change a person's mind, but cause them to believe their original stance more strongly. Why does this happen? Because beliefs are tied to identity, not just logic. When a belief is challenged, the mind reacts as if the self is under threat. It triggers emotional defense mechanisms, rationalization. dismissal, even memory distortion. And so the facts become weapons, and people shield themselves with certainty. The backfire effect doesn't only appear in politics. It shows up in health, religion, parenting, relationships. Telling someone they're wrong, even gently, often makes them grip tighter. For her, the woman who keeps showing him the research, the articles, the proof, the frustration is not just about disagreement. It's watching reason collapse beneath identity. Because the brain doesn't seek truth. It seeks comfort. Tragedy of the Commons in Group Experiments, 1968 present. When everyone consumes, everyone loses. What if your personal gain leads to collective collapse? In 1968, ecologist Garrett Hardin described a principle that would echo through environmental psychology, economics, and social behavior, the tragedy of the commons. The idea was simple. In a shared resource system, like a public pasture, individuals acting in their own interest can end up destroying the very thing everyone depends on. But this wasn't just a theory. Behavioral experiments soon followed. Groups were asked to share limited resources, fish from a digital pond, tokens from a pot, time from a communal clock. They were told if they took only a little, the resource would last. If they took too much, it would shrink and then disappear. Despite knowing the risk, many took more than their share. Why? Because they believed someone else would, or that their individual impact was too small to matter. Self-interest, even when rationalized, gradually led to depletion. The group lost everything, not because of evil, but because of accumulated choices. This tragedy plays out in traffic, climate, digital attention, and even relationships. When everyone scrolls without limit, real connection dies. When everyone interrupts, no one is heard. When everyone takes, even a little, the silence that follows feels earned. For her, the woman who gives more than she takes, who sees the common good as something worth protecting, the pain comes from watching others drain the well. Not all at once, but one scoop at a time. Just World Hypothesis Experiments, 1960s present. Believing victims deserve their pain. Why do we blame people for what was done to them? In the 1960s, psychologist Melvin Lerner conducted a series of experiments to study how people respond to the suffering of others, especially when that suffering seems unfair. Participants were shown a woman receiving painful electric shocks for a learning task. Some were told she volunteered. Others weren't. Some were told she'd be compensated. Others saw her continue with no benefit. What Lerner found was deeply unsettling. The more helpless the woman appeared, the more unjust the situation, the more likely participants were to blame her. They said she must have done something wrong, that she was exaggerating, that maybe she deserved it. Why? Because people needed to preserve their belief in a just world, the comforting illusion that good things happen to good people, and bad things happen for a reason. When faced with evidence to the contrary, the mind defends itself by shifting blame, not because it's cruel, but because it's scared. If innocent people suffer, then anyone can suffer, including her. The just world hypothesis helps explain victim blaming in sexual assault, poverty, illness, or war. It's not always malicious. Sometimes, it's just a terrified brain trying to keep the world simple. For her, the woman who was told it must have been her fault, who was asked what she was wearing, or why she stayed, this wasn't judgment. It was denial, disguised as logic. Because admitting she was innocent means accepting no one is safe. Framing Effect in Decision-Making, 1981. How a choice changes with a twist of words. Would you make the same decision if the words were just slightly different? In 1981, psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman conducted an experiment that exposed how fragile our decisions can be. Not because we lack information, but because our brains respond more to how something is phrased than to what it actually means. They asked participants to imagine a disease expected to kill 600 people. Then they presented two choices. Option A, 200 people will be saved. Option B, a 1/3 chance that all 600 will be saved, and a 2/3 chance that no one will be saved. Most people chose the certainty, 200 lives saved. It felt safe, clear, the right thing. But in another version, the same exact probabilities were presented, with only the wording reversed. Option A, 400 people will die. Option B, a 1/3 chance that no one will die, and a 2/3 chance that all 600 will die. Now, people were more likely to gamble. The riskier options suddenly felt more acceptable. The outcomes hadn't changed. Only the framing had. This is the framing effect, a deeply rooted bias in which decisions shift drastically depending on whether a situation is described in terms of gains or losses. Even if the math is identical, the brain doesn't just process numbers. It processes emotion, tone, and implication. The implications go far beyond this experiment. Politicians frame policy decisions to seem safer or scarier. Advertisers frame prices to sound like deals. News outlets frame headlines to provoke specific reactions. And in everyday life, even small shifts in language, I failed versus I learned, you're wrong versus can we think about it differently, can change the way an idea is received and whether it sticks. The unsettling truth behind this experiment isn't that people are illogical. It's that logic, on its own, is rarely the guiding force. The brain wants emotional coherence more than numerical precision. Most people believe their choices are driven by facts. But sometimes, all it takes is a gentle nudge, a single word, to steer them in a different direction entirely. Default Effect in Organ Donation, 2003. Letting the form decide your morality. What if one of your most ethical decisions was something you never actually chose? In 2003, behavioral economists Eric Johnson and Dan Goldstein examined the strange disparity in organ donation rates across Europe. In some countries, donation rates exceeded 90%. In others, they barely crossed 15%. And yet the populations were otherwise similar, culturally, religiously, even politically. What made the difference? It wasn't awareness campaigns. It wasn't religious doctrine. It wasn't personal belief. It was the design of the form. In countries like Austria and Belgium, citizens were automatically enrolled as organ donors unless they actively opted out. In countries like Germany and Denmark, people had to opt in to donate their organs. That tiny shift, defaulting the choice to yes instead of no, changed everything. This is called the default effect, a subtle but powerful bias where individuals are more likely to accept the preset option, especially in moments of uncertainty or emotional weight. In follow-up experiments, researchers presented participants with donation forms and found that people rarely changed the default, even when the decision was deeply personal. They assumed the default was the recommended or normal option, not realizing how much power the setup held. The deeper lesson is chilling. Inaction becomes the choice. This isn't limited to organ donation. It shows up in retirement savings plans, privacy settings, health insurance, end-of-life directives. Many life-altering outcomes are shaped by a moment of inattention, by leaving a box unchecked or clicking next without reading. We imagine that ethics are forged in deep thought, but more often, they're quietly shaped by interfaces, systems, and defaults. People don't decide to be selfish or generous. They follow the path of least resistance. A decision that feels like yours may have already been made for you. Illusion of Transparency, 1996. Thinking everyone can see right through you. What if your anxiety wasn't as obvious as it felt? In 1996, psychologists Kenneth Savitsky and Thomas Gilovich conducted a set of experiments exploring a subtle but powerful psychological illusion. The illusion of transparency, the belief that others can see our inner emotions more clearly than they actually can. In one study, participants were instructed to lie in a brief conversation and then rate how well they thought their deception was detected. Most believed their lies had been caught. They were sure they'd been obvious. that their discomfort had shown through. But when the researchers asked their partners, most said they hadn't noticed anything strange. In another experiment, people gave impromptu speeches, nervous, unprepared, visibly uncomfortable. Afterward, they assumed their anxiety had been painfully clear. But once again, observers thought they seemed composed and competent. The mind creates a spotlight, a belief that our internal state is leaking out, that everyone can see the sweat, the doubt, the panic. But that spotlight is imagined. Others aren't watching us as closely as we think. And even if they are, they don't see what we feel. This illusion can be paralyzing. People overexplain, withdraw, apologize for things no one else noticed. They avoid confrontation, avoid performance, avoid vulnerability, not because the world is harsh, but because they expect it to be. It also shows up in grief, shame, embarrassment, and trauma. When someone carries pain, they often believe it's written on their face, that if they smile, others will see the cracks beneath. So they retreat, not from others, but from the imagined mirror they believe is always watching. The tragedy is quiet. Most people are not judging you. They're not seeing your fear. They're too preoccupied with their own. What feels loud inside is often silent on the outside. Social loafing, 1979. Doing less when others are watching. Why do we work harder alone than in a group? In 1979, social psychologists Bibb Lawton, Kipling Williams, and Stephen Harkins explored an odd pattern of human behavior. They weren't studying teamwork. They were studying what happens when the team gets too big and effort starts to disappear. They called it social loafing, the tendency for individuals to exert less effort when working in a group than when working alone. To test it, participants were asked to wear blindfolds and headphones, then shout as loudly as they could. Sometimes they were told they were shouting alone. Sometimes they were told they were part of a group, even when they weren't. The results were clear. When people thought they were in a group, they shouted less forcefully, even if no one else was actually contributing. Their perceived group size diluted their effort. The more people they believed were involved, the less responsible they felt. This effect has been replicated in other settings: tug-of-war, brainstorming sessions, classroom participation. It shows up in offices, committees, even online forums. The larger the group, the more people assume that someone else will step up. But often no one does. What makes social loafing disturbing isn't just the lost effort. It's the invisible erosion of accountability. People disengage not because they're lazy, but because they believe their individual role doesn't matter. In emergencies, this leads to the bystander effect, the tragic failure to act because someone else will. In workplaces, it leads to burnout, as a few overperform while others fade quietly into the background. And in society, it creates the illusion of participation without responsibility. We are taught to value teamwork, but when no one feels individually seen, the team dissolves, not in conflict, but in silence. Pluralistic Ignorance, 1980s present. When everyone is faking agreement, what if everyone in the room secretly disagrees? Pluralistic ignorance is one of the strangest and most destabilizing social phenomena ever studied, because it reveals how entire groups can pretend to believe something they privately reject. The term dates back to early 20th century sociology, but it wasn't until later decades that psychologists began to explore it experimentally. In one version, students were asked privately how comfortable they felt with heavy drinking on campus. Most admitted feeling uneasy. Then they were asked how comfortable they thought everyone else was with it. Most said others were totally fine with it. And so, they drank, not because they wanted to, but because they assumed everyone else wanted to, and they didn't want to seem different. That's pluralistic ignorance, when a group of people silently disagrees, but continues to behave as if they agree, because they falsely believe they're the only ones who feel that way. It shows up in classrooms where no one asks questions because everyone's pretending they understand. In political movements where people cheer loudly but feel uneasy inside. In relationships where both people stay, not out of love, but out of assumption that the other wants to stay. It creates cultures of silence, where truth is buried beneath performance. This phenomenon is especially insidious because it traps people in false consensus. Everyone thinks they're the only one who feels out of place, so no one speaks up, and the silence becomes its own form of reinforcement. The most dangerous beliefs aren't the ones we argue about. They're the ones we pretend to share. Decoy effect in choice architecture, 1982. Manipulating preferences with a third option. What if your favorite choice was chosen for you? In 1982, researchers studying consumer behavior discovered a curious pattern. When people were presented with two options, they would often choose based on preference, value, or intuition. But when a third, strategically designed option was added, one that no one really wanted, it subtly shifted choices in a predictable way. This became known as the decoy effect. Imagine this scenario. Option A, a compact camera for $300. Option B, a deluxe camera for $500. Most people were split. Some chose affordability. Others chose features. But when a third option was added, Option C, a deluxe camera for $550, slightly worse than Option B. Suddenly, more people chose Option B. Why? Because Option C made it look like a better deal. The decoy, though rarely selected, made one of the original choices more appealing by comparison. This effect has been observed in politics, product marketing, subscription services, and even dating apps. A weaker, similar third option can be introduced not to be chosen, but to frame another option as superior. The brain doesn't evaluate options in isolation. It compares. And when those comparisons are manipulated, the illusion of free choice begins to crumble. The disturbing part? Most people don't realize it's happening. They believe they've made an objective decision, not knowing that their preference was guided by design, by the architecture of the choice, not the content of the options. And in a world of constant offerings, from streaming platforms to life decisions, how many of our choices are truly ours? False consensus effect, 1977. Believing everyone thinks like you. What if the loudest belief in your mind isn't shared by anyone else? In 1977, psychologists Lee Ross, David Green, and Pamela House published a study that exposed a subtle distortion in how people perceive the world around them. They asked participants to read about a controversial scenario, a student who vandalized school property as a form of protest, and then decide whether they'd support or condemn the action. After participants made their choice, they were asked to estimate how many others would agree with them, and how those people would view the opposing choice. What emerged was a striking pattern. Regardless of what participants chose, they believed that most other people would agree with them, and that those who disagreed must be uninformed or irrational. This became known as the false consensus effect, the cognitive bias where individuals overestimate how common their beliefs, values, and behaviors are, assuming they're more universal than they actually are. It's not arrogance. It's an unconscious tendency. When we feel strongly about something, we assume it's obvious. When we behave in a certain way, we think others would do the same. But often, we're projecting, not observing. This effect shows up everywhere: politics, ethics, parenting, health choices. A person who supports a cause imagines that everyone is finally waking up. A person who breaks a rule assumes everyone else does it too. But reality is more fragmented than we think. The false consensus effect doesn't just distort our understanding of others. It fuels division, misunderstanding, and surprise when the world doesn't match our internal map. It also isolates. When someone feels out of place, they may assume they're the only one who thinks differently. They stay quiet, thinking their view is rare, when in truth, others may feel the same but are just as silent. What we believe isn't always wrong, but how many people believe it with us? That's harder to know than it feels. Misinformation effect in real-world memory, 1970s, present. Changing what people think they saw. What if the story you're telling replaced the memory you once had? Throughout the 1970s and beyond, psychologist Elizabeth Loftus explored one of the most deeply unsettling aspects of human memory, that it can be rewritten by the slightest suggestion. In one of her early studies, participants watched footage of a car crash. Later, they were asked questions, but some were subtly manipulated. Instead of asking, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? They were asked, how fast were they going when they smashed into each other? Those who heard smashed reported higher speeds. Some even claimed to remember seeing broken glass, even though there was none. This is the misinformation effect, the process by which post-event information alters the original memory. It doesn't just distort recall, it replaces it. Loftus's work extended to real criminal cases, where eyewitnesses were led, sometimes accidentally, sometimes intentionally, to remember details that never existed. These memories felt just as real as true ones. People weren't lying. They were sure. What makes this dangerous is its invisibility. Most people assume their memories are stable, that what they recall is a faithful record. But memory isn't like a video file. It's more like a story, edited each time it's told. This effect plays out in therapy, in courtrooms, in family arguments, and even in the headlines we read. A repeated narrative, even if false, can become embedded in what someone believes they saw. And when someone insists on their version of events, they may not be manipulating the truth. They may simply be holding on to a memory that was planted after the fact. Moral luck, 1976. Judging people by outcomes they couldn't control. What if how good you are depends on how lucky you were? In 1976, philosophers Thomas Nagel and Bernard Williams introduced a troubling concept to moral psychology. Moral luck, the idea that a person's morality is often judged based not on their intentions, but on the consequences of their actions, even if those consequences were completely out of their control. Psychologists followed this thread with real-world experiments. One study asked participants to evaluate two drivers. Both were texting while driving. One hit a pedestrian. The other didn't, simply because no one crossed their path. Despite the identical behavior, people judged the one who caused harm more harshly, assigning blame, punishment, and moral failure, even though the only difference was luck. This bias appears constantly in legal systems, relationships, and public opinion. Two people can make the same bad decision, but the one with the worst outcome is labeled immoral, reckless, or evil. Why? Because outcomes are vivid, and intention is invisible. The mind wants to explain suffering, and so it assigns fault, even where there was none. But this creates an ethical paradox. Is morality about what you meant to do, or what ended up happening? Moral luck blurs that line. It suggests that even our most confident judgments about others or ourselves may rest on variables no one could control. And when we feel guilt, or anger, or blame, how much of it is truly about right and wrong? And how much is just about how the story ended? Choice blindness, 2005. When you don't notice your choice was switched. What if you didn't even realize the thing you chose wasn't what you got? In 2005, psychologists Peter Johansson, Lars Hall, and colleagues conducted a series of experiments in Sweden that uncovered a surprising fault line in our perception of free will and self-awareness. They asked participants to view pairs of faces and choose which person they found more attractive. After each decision, they were handed the photo they had supposedly picked and asked to explain their reasoning. But here's the twist. In several trials, the researchers secretly swapped the photo and gave participants the one they had not chosen. Most participants didn't notice the switch. And even more surprising, they proceeded to confidently explain why they had picked the face they didn't actually choose, offering justifications, preferences, and imagined insights for a decision they never made. This became known as choice blindness the inability to detect a mismatch between intention and outcome, and the brain's tendency to rationalize whatever it ends up with. The implications are staggering. If people can be unaware of what they've just chosen, and even defend it, how much of decision-making is post hoc storytelling? How many of our preferences, opinions, or beliefs are not fixed traits, but flexible explanations crafted after the fact? This doesn't mean people are lying. They're not faking. The brain simply doesn't notice certain changes when the story still feels coherent. Choice blindness has since been observed in political surveys, consumer preferences, and moral judgments. People agree with one view, then accept and defend its opposite when it's disguised as their original stance. What's unsettling is how confident they feel while doing it. It reveals that certainty is often built on a feeling of consistency, not on accurate memory or logic. And if you can explain a choice you never made, how sure can you really be of any decision? Effort justification, 1959. Suffering that feels worth it. Why do people love things that made them suffer? In 1959, psychologists Elliot Aronson and Judson Mills conducted a now-classic study on cognitive dissonance, but this time, they focused on effort. They asked women to take part in a discussion about the psychology of sex. But before joining the discussion group, each participant had to pass a screening test. Some were given a mild initiation, reading neutral words aloud. Others went through a severe initiation, reading sexually explicit passages in front of male experimenters. Afterward, everyone listened to the same boring conversation from the supposed discussion group, intentionally designed to be dull and uninteresting. Here's where it gets strange. Those who endured the severe initiation rated the discussion as far more interesting and valuable than those in the mild or control groups. Why? Because their minds needed to justify the suffering. If they had gone through something uncomfortable or embarrassing, the outcome had to be worth it. Otherwise, it would mean enduring pain for no reason. This is called effort justification, a subtype of cognitive dissonance. The brain doesn't just want experiences to be meaningful. It wants struggles to feel earned. It shows up in rituals, fraternity hazing, marathon training, expensive purchases, and abusive relationships. The more you pay in time, pain, or emotion, the more valuable something feels, even when it's not. This mechanism can help people persevere, but it can also trap them, defending harmful situations, broken systems, or failed beliefs, simply because they invested too much to walk away. Sometimes, we don't love something because it's good. We love it because we suffered to get it. Belief perseverance, 1981. When facts can't undo first impressions. What if changing your mind has nothing to do with facts? In 1981, psychologists Craig Anderson, Mark Lepper, and Lee Ross conducted a series of experiments to investigate how people respond to evidence, especially evidence that contradicts their original beliefs. Participants were presented with fictional data about whether people who were good at firefighting tended to be risk-takers or more cautious. One group received fake studies showing risk-takers were better. Another group saw studies claiming cautious people performed better. Then the researchers revealed the truth. All the data had been made up. Logically, the participants should have dropped their belief. But they didn't, even after learning that the evidence was false. Most people stuck with their initial conclusions. They not only held on to the belief, they built new reasons to justify it. The original impression had created a psychological anchor that facts alone couldn't dislodge. This is known as belief perseverance, the tendency to cling to a belief even after the information that originally supported it has been discredited. It shows up in politics, health misinformation, conspiracy theories, and personal judgments. Once someone labels another person as untrustworthy, even overwhelming contrary evidence won't reverse that perception easily. The brain builds belief scaffolding quickly, but tears it down slowly. This bias isn't about intelligence. It's about the way the mind protects coherence. To admit the first belief was wrong feels destabilizing. So instead, people reinterpret or reject the new evidence. Even when the facts are clear, the story we've told ourselves is harder to let go. Ostracism and Social Pain, 2000. The brain treats rejection like physical harm. What if being left out actually hurts your body? In the year 2000, psychologists Eisenberger, Lieberman, and Williams conducted a now famous study that merged social psychology with neuroscience. Their goal was to test a claim long assumed to be metaphorical, that social rejection hurts. Using an fMRI scanner, they had participants play a virtual ball-tossing game called Cyberball while lying in the machine. At first, the other two players, computer-controlled, tossed the ball regularly to the participant. Then, without warning, they stopped. The participant was ignored, excluded, left out. Here's what happened next. The anterior cingulate cortex, the same area of the brain that activates during physical pain, lit up in response to social rejection. The result was startling. The brain doesn't distinguish sharply between social pain and physical pain. Being excluded activates the same neural circuitry as being burned, cut, or bruised. This is more than poetic. It's physiological, and it explains why experiences like bullying, abandonment, silent treatment, or social humiliation linger in the body, not just emotionally, but neurologically. Subsequent studies found that the pain of social exclusion can even be eased by taking acetaminophen, Tylenol, further reinforcing the biological overlap. This reframes countless everyday interactions. Ghosting, ignoring someone's message, excluding a peer. The damage isn't just emotional. It's neurological. The body reacts to rejection as if it were injury. It also helps explain why social bonds feel so essential, and why the threat of losing them can drive people to conform, over-apologize, or stay silent. Rejection doesn't just feel like pain. To the brain, it is pain. The Illusion of Asymmetric Insight, 2001. Thinking you understand others better than they understand you. What if you thought you knew others deeply, but believed no one really knew you? In 2001, a team of psychologists led by Emily Pronine, Daniel Lin, and Lee Ross studied a cognitive distortion that quietly erodes empathy, a bias known as the illusion of asymmetric insight. Participants were asked to assess how well they understood their friends, coworkers, or acquaintances, and then estimate how well those people understood them in return. The results were lopsided. Most participants believed they understood others deeply, their motivations, fears, blind spots, but that those same people only had a shallow grasp of their own inner world. The implication is unsettling. We believe others are more transparent than us, easier to read, easier to predict. But we also believe that we're complex, nuanced, and misunderstood. This creates a hidden imbalance in social perception. We walk through relationships, personal or professional, assuming we get others while being hard to get ourselves. And this imbalance leads to arrogance, miscommunication, and loneliness. When applied at a group level, this illusion deepens division. I understand why they think what they think, but they don't understand me. It sounds reasonable, but it creates the psychological scaffolding for polarization, moral superiority, and resentment. What the study shows is not just an ego trap, but a blind spot. Everyone is looking at each other through fogged glass, assuming their own window is clear. And the tragedy? They're all wrong. The mind doesn't just struggle to understand others. It struggles to see how little it understands itself. The Spotlight Effect, 2000. Overestimating how much others notice you. What if no one is actually paying attention, but your brain swears they are? In a 2000 study, psychologists Thomas Gilovich, Victoria Medvec, and Kenneth Savitsky uncovered a subtle but powerful illusion. The spotlight effect, the tendency to vastly overestimate how much others are noticing you. In one version of the study, participants were asked to wear an embarrassing t-shirt, one featuring a large image of the pop singer Barry Manilow, and then enter a room full of strangers. Afterward, They were asked how many people they thought had noticed the shirt. Most guessed that over half the room had seen it. In reality, only about 23% had. The researchers repeated the experiment with other conditions: public mistakes, awkward behavior, unexpected moments of clumsiness. Each time, participants believed they had been seen and judged far more than they actually were. The effect stems from the brain's self-focus. We are always at the center of our own experiences, and so we assume we're at the center of everyone else's, too. But in truth, most people are thinking about themselves, their own flaws, fears, and imagined spotlights. The spotlight effect can lead to social anxiety, overcorrection, avoidance, and even unnecessary guilt. It traps people in the fear of being watched. When no one's looking, it also dulls freedom. People hold back opinions, outfits, ideas, all because they believe the crowd is watching closely. But often, the crowd isn't even paying attention. The world isn't ignoring you out of cruelty. It's just too busy worrying about its own shirt. The Curse of Knowledge, 1989. Forgetting what it's like to not know. What if knowing something made it impossible to imagine not knowing it? In 1989, psychologists Elizabeth Newton introduced a simple experiment that revealed a quiet flaw in how humans teach, explain, and understand one another, a bias called the Curse of Knowledge. In her study, participants were assigned to one of two roles: tappers and listeners. Tappers were told to pick a well-known song, like Happy Birthday, and tap its rhythm on the table. Listeners, hearing only the taps, had to guess the song. Tappers were confident. Most believed the listeners would guess the tune correctly about 50% of the time. In reality, the listeners got it right only 2.5% of the time. The problem? Once the tappers knew the song, they heard it in their mind while tapping. The rhythm was obvious to them, but the listeners had no context, no melody, just hollow taps. This is the curse of knowledge, the inability to fully recall what it's like not to know something once you already know it. It's why teachers struggle to explain concepts to beginners, why experts often sound confusing, why feedback from a manager or advice from a friend feels vague, rushed, or impatient. Once we have a fact, a skill, or an insight, it becomes embedded in how we think, and we assume others share that same mental landscape. When they don't, the curse fuels miscommunication. Parents forget how hard it was to be a teenager. Coders forget what it was like to not know syntax. Even empathy stumbles when people can't remember what it felt like to be confused, anxious, or wrong. And the more we know, the harder it becomes to imagine being in the dark, which is why the best communicators aren't just wise. They remember what it felt like to not understand. Simulated Prisoner's Dilemma, 1965. The game that trains distrust. What if a simple game made you trust less forever? In 1965, psychologist Anatole Rappaport began studying one of the most influential psychological games of all time, The Prisoner's Dilemma. It's a decision-making scenario where two players must choose whether to cooperate or betray each other, with varying rewards or punishments based on their combined choices. If both cooperate, both gain moderately. If one betrays while the other cooperates, the betrayer wins big, and the cooperator loses. If both betray, both lose, but less than the trusting one would have alone. Over decades of experimentation, one thing became clear: even when trust is the optimal strategy, players often choose betrayal. Why? Because fear takes over. In long simulations where the game is repeated, players who've been betrayed once begin assuming betrayal. Even when none occurs, they become reactive, suspicious, and increasingly self-protective. Betrayal echoes. Some even start betraying preemptively, not out of greed, but to avoid feeling foolish. This effect has been studied not just in labs, but in international negotiations, economic policy, and marital therapy. People enter situations willing to trust, but the first sign of vulnerability being exploited shifts their strategy forever. The damage isn't just strategic. It's emotional. People remember the betrayal longer than they remember the benefit of cooperation. The pain of being the fool outlasts the rewards of working together. Over time, this creates a feedback loop, one where everyone expects the worst, and therefore creates it. The prisoner's dilemma doesn't just measure distrust. It teaches it. Mere exposure effect, 1968. Liking something just because you see it a lot. What if you didn't love something? You just got used to it. In 1968, psychologist Robert Zajonc conducted a series of studies that would later define one of the most quietly influential principles in social psychology, the mere exposure effect. He showed participants random symbols, faces, or sounds, some only once, others repeatedly. Later, he asked which ones they liked more. Time and again, the items seen more often were rated more positively, even though they were meaningless or unfamiliar. Just seeing something more made it feel better. This seems small until you realize it applies to nearly everything: advertising, politics, art, music, even relationships. We tend to trust familiar faces. We grow fond of songs we once disliked after hearing them multiple times. We develop preferences for brands, places, and even people, not because they're superior, but because they're present. What makes this effect unsettling is how it operates below awareness. People don't realize they're favoring what's familiar. They believe they've made rational choices, that they prefer a politician for their message, or a product for its quality, not realizing they're simply reacting to exposure frequency. In a world flooded with repeated messaging, visibility becomes power. The more something is shown, the more likely it is to be liked, not for what it is, but for how often it appears. And over time, familiarity doesn't just breed comfort. It disguises itself as truth. The Endowment Effect, 1990. When ownership warps value. What if owning something made it worth more in your mind? In 1990, psychologists Daniel Kahneman, Jack Netsch, and Richard Thaler conducted a deceptively simple experiment that revealed a deep irrationality in how humans assign value. Not based on need, not based on quality, but based on ownership. Participants were randomly given a mug. Others received nothing. Later, the researchers offered to let people sell or trade the mug. Those who had just received the mug, just minutes earlier, demanded more money to part with it than others were willing to pay to obtain one. The mug hadn't changed. Its function, design, and value were identical. But to the new owner, it was now worth more, simply because it was theirs. This became known as the Endowment Effect, the tendency for people to assign more value to things they own, even if ownership was randomly assigned, even if the object holds no sentimental meaning. Follow-up studies found the same distortion in decisions involving tickets, pens, snacks, real estate, and more. People wanted more to give up something they had than they were willing to pay to get it. The effect doesn't come from greed. It comes from loss aversion. Once we own something, parting with it feels like losing a part of ourselves. The brain perceives potential loss more intensely than potential gain, and the implications ripple outward. People hold onto outdated beliefs, unfulfilling jobs, even broken relationships, not because they're good, but because they're theirs. Giving them up feels like giving up identity, control, certainty. Possession creates emotional glue. The mind clings to what it already has, not just objects, but ideas, habits, routines. And when asked to let go, it demands more in return than the thing is worth. The endowment effect blurs the line between value and attachment. It reveals that sometimes what we call love, loyalty, or investment is just the fear of losing what we've already claimed. We believe our choices are rational, but in the end, we often defend what's familiar, not because it's right, but because it's ours.